On the night of June 5th moving into June 6th, 1944, more than 6,000 paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division boarded C-47 transport aircraft in southern England. Each man carried equipment weighing roughly 60 to 80 pounds: rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, radio batteries, medical kits. Reserve parachutes were strapped tight across chests. Aircraft engines burned aviation fuel measured in thousands of gallons for the crossing. The distance to Normandy was just over 100 miles, but that stretch of sky carried anti-aircraft fire, low clouds, and navigational risk. The division's objective was not symbolic. It was mechanical. Secure causeways behind Utah Beach, destroy German artillery batteries, fracture road networks so armored reserves could not collide with landing forces at dawn. Timing was calculated to the minute. Paratroopers were to land hours before amphibious troops hit the sand. As the armada of aircraft approached the Cotentin Peninsula, German flak batteries opened fire. Shells burst in black puffs around aluminum fuselages. Pilots swerved to avoid tracer arcs. Formations scattered. Some aircraft flew too fast. Others veered off course under evasive maneuvers. Pathfinders on the ground attempted to mark drop zones with beacon lights, but smoke and confusion eroded precision. Inside one aircraft, banking hard under fire, a paratrooper felt the vibration of engines through the metal floor. Sweat gathered under his helmet, despite cold air rushing through the fuselage. The jump light flicked from red to green. In seconds, he stepped into wind measured at over 100 miles per hour. Static lines snapped tight. Canopies opened, or failed to open. Some men struck flooded fields. Others landed miles from assigned objectives. Dispersion was severe. Units landed scattered across an area spanning more than 20 miles. Some companies assembled only a fraction of their authorized strength in the first hours. Casualty rates during the drop and immediate aftermath varied, with certain sticks losing men to anti-aircraft fire or drowning in inundated lowlands. Equipment bundles dropped separately were lost in hedgerows and marsh. Yet fragmentation produced improvisation. Small groups coalesced around whoever held rank. Roadblocks were established using explosives weighing several pounds each to crater intersections. German garrisons, uncertain of the scale of the drop, faced attacks from unpredictable directions. Bridges were seized. Causeways were secured in fragmented engagements measured in minutes and yards. When I once reviewed after-action reports alongside German field dispatches from the same night, I noticed how often German commanders overestimated the size of American forces due to the randomness of contact. A squad firing from a hedgerow appeared as a battalion in the dark. Confusion fractured German response time. The 101st did not land in clean formation. It landed in chaos. But chaos stalled German consolidation. By dawn, despite scattered assembly, key causeways leading inland from Utah Beach were in American hands. German counterattacks collided with dispersed but determined resistance. Artillery pieces weighing over 1,000 pounds were disabled or destroyed. Communications lines were cut. The cost was not light. Over the course of the Normandy campaign's opening days, the division sustained casualties numbering in the thousands. Some units reported effective strengths reduced by more than 30%. Yet, objectives that enabled the seaborne landings to move inland were largely achieved. Steel and numbers mattered in the larger picture. Over 5,000 ships and landing craft approached the Normandy coast that morning. Behind them lay industrial capacity measured in millions of tons of shipping and equipment. But for those first hours inland, the outcome hinged on small groups of airborne soldiers holding narrow strips of road. As daylight broke, paratroopers who had landed alone found others filtering in from fields and orchards. Improvised command posts formed in farmhouses with walls inches thick against small arms fire, but vulnerable to mortar shells. Radios crackled, ammunition was redistributed. Machine guns were positioned to cover hedgerow lanes, barely wide enough for a single vehicle. The drop did not proceed according to ideal planning. It fractured under flak and weather. Yet it did not stall entirely. It adapted under fire. The division's mission to secure the western flank of the invasion collided with disorder and pressed forward anyway. If you are listening now in the quiet of late hours, imagine that sky over Normandy before dawn. Engines droning in long lines, red lights glowing inside aircraft, then sudden silence as parachutes bloom against darkness, men descending into fields they have never seen. No dramatic music, just wind and distant gunfire. Let that image settle as your breathing slows. In the chapters ahead, we will trace the Pathfinders, the scattered landings, the fight for the Causeways, and the consolidation after sunrise. This is the entire history of the 101st Airborne's night drop into Normandy. Chapter 1. The Manifests That Didn't Add Up. The 5th of May, 1944, a canvas-topped military tent somewhere in southern England. Inside, stacked on a folding table beneath a single electric bulb, sit 432 manila folders, one for each C-47 transport aircraft, scheduled to carry the 101st Airborne Division into France. Captain Richard Davidson flips through the aircraft loading manifests for perhaps the 12th time this week, and something doesn't quite reconcile. Chalk 66, the designation for one particular aircraft stick, shows Sergeant Richard Winters penciled into 3 different jump positions across 3 different revisions of the same document. Not crossed out and corrected, just layered. The carbon paper smudged where someone erased and rewrote his name, then apparently changed their mind again. Davidson rubs his eyes. He's been staring at these papers since 0400 hours, and the inconsistencies keep multiplying the longer he looks. In the archives of the National World War II Museum, researchers can still examine Davidson's notes from this period, marginal annotations in fading blue ink that grow increasingly terse as May becomes June. Recalculate weights appears beside one manifest. Who authorized this change beside another? The administrative machinery of Operation Overlord, the largest amphibious invasion in human history, was supposed to be a masterpiece of logistical coordination. Instead, what Davidson was discovering in that tent was something closer to controlled chaos. The 101st Airborne Division was scheduled to drop behind Utah Beach in precisely 31 days, and the loading manifests, the fundamental documents determining which soldiers would jump from which aircraft over which drop zones, were still being rewritten almost daily. It fascinates me how military historians tend to begin D-Day narratives with the beach landings, or perhaps the Pathfinders hitting French soil, skipping entirely over this earlier breakdown. But here in these smudged carbon copies, you can see the invasion's first failure already taking shape. The jump into Normandy didn't go wrong when pilots encountered flak over the Cotentin Peninsula. It went wrong weeks earlier, in English airfields, when the American military's administrative systems began collapsing under the sheer weight of coordinating nearly 7,000 paratroopers, their equipment, and the aircraft to carry them. The load manifests were supposed to be finalized by mid-April. By late May, regimental supply officers were still receiving revised chalk assignments, often with less than 72 hours notice before the next training jump. Men who'd trained for months with specific squads were suddenly reassigned to different aircraft. Equipment bundles carefully packed for specific drop zones were redistributed. The cascade of changes created a documentation problem that would prove prophetic. Consider the mathematics of the thing. Each C-47 Skytrain could carry 18 paratroopers in full combat load, roughly 80 to 90 pounds of equipment per man, depending on their role. Multiply that by 432 aircraft in the 101st's initial serial, and you're moving more than 600 tons of human beings and materiel through the night sky, all of which needs to exit those aircraft in precise sequence over precise coordinates. The Pathfinders would mark drop zones using Eureka radar beacons and holophane lamps, but only if the Pathfinders themselves landed accurately. And the Pathfinders were carried in the same aircraft, subject to the same navigational uncertainties, experiencing the same last-minute manifest revisions. A British planning officer wrote in his diary that American airborne operations reminded him of watching a man build a pocket watch while wearing boxing gloves. He wasn't wrong. The revisions weren't arbitrary. They reflected real problems. In early May, an equipment weight audit discovered that the combat loads initially approved for the jump exceeded the safe carrying capacity of the C-47s by an average of 300 pounds per aircraft. The solution was to redistribute heavier items, mortars, machine gun ammunition, radio batteries. But redistributing meant reassigning, and reassigning meant rewriting manifests. Then there was the Pathfinder question. Initial plans called for Pathfinder teams from the 8th 2nd Airborne Division to mark some of the 101st drop zones, but inter-division coordination proved so problematic that Captain Frank Lillyman was tasked with training volunteers from both divisions specifically for the Normandy operation. This meant pulling men from their assigned chalks and creating new ones, More revisions, more carbon paper, more smudges. What strikes me about this period is how invisible it remains in popular memory. We remember Eisenhower visiting the 101st on the evening of the 5th of June, his famous words to the paratroopers about how they were about to embark upon a great crusade. We don't remember that when those men boarded their aircraft a few hours later, roughly 1 in 4 was jumping with a stick he'd only met within the past 10 days. We celebrate the courage of soldiers who dropped into darkness over occupied France, but we don't talk about the fact that administrative confusion had already compromised unit cohesion before the first parachute opened. The manifest problem wasn't a bureaucratic footnote. It was a leading indicator of systemic fragility. By late May, the supply situation had become acute enough that Colonel Gerald Higgins, the 101st's Chief of Staff, sent a memo to division headquarters noting that equipment accountability was deteriorating rapidly. The division was scheduled to jump with approximately 487 tons of weapons, ammunition, rations, medical supplies, radio equipment, and demolition charges packed into equipment bundles that would be pushed from aircraft on separate parachutes. But the loading manifests showed persistent discrepancies between planned weights and actual weights. Some bundles were coming in 30% heavier than specifications allowed. Others couldn't be located at all, having been misdirected to different airfields during the constant shuffling of supplies. The quartermaster logs record a mounting sense of confusion, requests for items that had already been issued, duplicate shipments arriving at the wrong locations, serial numbers that didn't match inventory lists. And then, there's the numbers problem I keep returning to. According to official planning documents held at the National Archives, the 101st Airborne Division was authorized to deploy 6,600 men for the Normandy operation. Yet regimental rosters compiled on the 4th of June show 6,928 names. Someone, somewhere, added 328 additional paratroopers to the jump without updating the master planning documents. Who were they? Replacements filling out understrength companies? Specialists added at the last minute? Volunteers who talked their way aboard? The discrepancy was never officially explained, and historians argue about it to this day. What's certain is that the extra bodies meant extra weight, extra equipment requirements, and another layer of confusion added to manifests that were already breaking down. To me, the most telling detail isn't the battle itself, but the supply officer's quiet desperation in the week before departure. Davidson's notes from the 1st of June describe him working through the night to hand-correct manifest errors, physically comparing aircraft loading lists against regimental personnel rosters, and finding mismatches in nearly 40% of chalks. He wasn't fixing a paperwork error. He was trying to impose order on a system that had exceeded its organizational capacity. The American military in 1944 could build tens of thousands of aircraft, train hundreds of thousands of paratroopers, and coordinate the movement of millions of tons of supplies across an ocean. But it couldn't reliably track which 18 men were supposed to jump from which airplane. There's a broader pattern here that becomes visible only when you step back from the heroic narratives. The Normandy invasion succeeded, spectacularly, decisively, but not because the planning was perfect. It succeeded despite planning that was, in many critical respects, coming apart at the seams. The manifests are just one example, but they're a revealing one. They show an organization pushing up against the limits of what mid-20th century administrative technology could handle. Card files, typewriters, carbon paper, telephone calls. These were the tools available for coordinating an operation involving millions of moving parts. And when you're trying to manage complexity at that scale with those tools, you don't get elegant solutions. You get approximations, workarounds, and a lot of people working very long hours, trying to patch over the gaps between the plan and the reality. By the evening of the 5th of June, when the paratroopers of the 101st began boarding their aircraft at airfields across southern England, the manifest situation still wasn't fully resolved. Some chalks had been reorganized as recently as 48 hours earlier. Some men didn't know their jumpmaster's name. Some jumpmasters were leading men they'd never trained with. In later interviews, veterans would describe a strange atmosphere on the airfields that night. Not panic exactly, but an undercurrent of uncertainty that went beyond the normal pre-combat jitters. They'd trained for this operation for months, run through it dozens of times on practice drops, memorized objectives and rally points and recognition signals. But at the last minute, the the fundamental architecture of the mission, who was jumping with whom, from which aircraft, had been scrambled. The administrative chaos hadn't broken their morale or their determination. It had just added another variable to a mission that was already staggeringly complex. The C-47s began taking off shortly after 2200 hours on the 5th of June. 432 aircraft, carrying 6,928 men, though nobody had quite that precise number at the time, lumbered into the air and formed up over the English Channel for the flight to Normandy. Inside those aircraft, men sat in near darkness, weighted down with equipment, squeezed shoulder to shoulder on canvas seats, feeling the engines vibrate through the aluminum floor. Some slept, some prayed, some just sat and thought about what was coming. Very few of them knew that the manifest system had partially collapsed, that their careful pre-mission planning was now partly obsolete, that they might be jumping into France with soldiers they barely knew. That information stayed with the officers and the supply clerks. It wasn't the kind of thing you shared with men heading into combat, and so the flight continued. Out over the dark water, toward the coast of France, toward drop zones that Pathfinders were supposed to be marking, but might not reach, toward an enemy that might be alert or might be sleeping, toward a mission that would be remembered as one of the great triumphs of American military history, even though the administrative groundwork had quietly, invisibly, come undone in the weeks before anyone jumped. The manifests still sit in archives now, 80 years later, a fossil record of organizational stress. Smudged carbon copies, crossed-out names, penciled corrections layered over earlier corrections, evidence that the invasion of Normandy, for all its meticulous planning, was also an improvisation, a controlled catastrophe that succeeded not because everything went according to plan, but because enough people, at enough levels, were good enough at solving problems in real time to overcome the fact that the plan itself was breaking. Chapter 2. The Last Hours in England. The 4th of June, 1944. The village of Airborne in Wiltshire, roughly 80 miles west of London. Sunday morning, and the church bells aren't ringing. They haven't rung since 1940, when the British government ordered all church bells silenced, except as a warning of invasion. But this Sunday, the church is full anyway. Soldiers of the 101st Airborne Division, many of them crowding into pews they've occupied on and off for the past 9 months. The division chaplains reported attendance figures in their logs. 73% of available personnel at morning services across the regiment, compared to 41% the previous Sunday. Nobody ordered them to attend. They came because it felt like something you did before you stopped existing. Private George Lewes sits in a back pew, hands folded, not particularly listening to the chaplain. Lewes is a radio operator with Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, known throughout the battalion as the company comedian, the guy who does pitch-perfect impressions of officers, who can diffuse tension with a well-timed joke. But this morning, he's quiet, just watching the light slant through the church windows and thinking about things he doesn't usually think about. Years later, in an interview for an oral history project, he described that church service as the moment when the war stopped being an adventure and became real. Not during training, not during the equipment checks, not even during Eisenhower's visit. In that church, with sunlight coming through old English stained glass, was when it hit him that a meaningful percentage of the men in those pews weren't coming back. The thing about the last 48 hours before a combat operation is that memory gets strange. Time moves differently. Small details become significant. The oral histories collected from 101st veterans show a surprising consistency in what they remembered from those final hours. Not the grand moments, not the speeches or the formal preparations, but tiny personal rituals. The way someone polished jump boots that were already clean. The sound of a foxhole companion's voice reciting the Lord's Prayer for the first time anyone had heard him pray. The taste of English beer, which most of them had complained about for months, but now drank with something approaching reverence. These were men in their early 20s, most of them, who'd volunteered for airborne duty because it paid an extra $50 a month and came with a certain swagger. Now they were 48 hours from jumping into occupied France, and the swagger had been replaced by something more complicated. Airborne had been the 101st's home since September of 1943, 9 months billeted in British homes and Nissen huts, training on British moors, running practice jumps over British countryside. The village had roughly 1,000 permanent residents. The division brought 6,000 soldiers. It was overcrowded, noisy, and as one villager described it in her diary, exhausting but never dull. The Americans brought jazz music, cigarettes, chewing gum, and an easy, informal confidence that alternately charmed and irritated the locals. They also brought money. The Crown Inn, the village's main pub, did better business between September 43 and June 44 than in any comparable period in its 200-year history. And on the evening of the 4th of June, knowing that the Americans would be gone soon, though not officially knowing why or where, the landlord opened early and kept the taps running late. When I cross-reference the chaplain reports with the battalion expenditure logs, I find something interesting. Alcohol consumption in the 506th Regiment increased by roughly 40% in the 3 days before deployment compared to the weekly average. Not surprising in itself, soldiers drink before combat. That's documented across every war in history. What's notable is the shift in drinking patterns. The usual rowdy Saturday nights gave way to quieter gatherings. Small groups of men sitting in pub corners, nursing pints, talking in low voices, or not talking at all. The landlady of the Crown Inn wrote in a letter to her sister that the Americans were subdued, almost gentle, that final weekend. These were paratroopers, elite troops selected for physical toughness and aggressiveness, and they spent their last night in England drinking quietly in a village pub, as if they were trying to memorize the feel of being alive in a place where people weren't trying to kill them. There's a beer coaster in the collection of the Wiltshire Museum, donated in 1989 by a local resident who found it tucked in the rafters of her cottage. Written on it in fading ink, 506 PIRE Company, June 4, 1944, followed by 11 signatures. None of the men bothered to write their full names, just first names or nicknames. Bull, Skip, Malark, Shifty. These are the kinds of things soldiers do when they know, at some level they're not quite admitting, that they're creating evidence they existed. The coaster sat in a Wiltshire attic for 45 years before anyone thought to examine it systematically. When researchers finally cross-referenced the signatures with company rosters, they identified 8 of the 11 men. 3 survived the war, 5 didn't. The coaster is evidence of a moment, not a dramatic moment, not a battlefield moment, just a moment when 11 men sat together in an English pub and wrote their names down, preserving a fragment of themselves before stepping into whatever came next. The battalion memorial service on Sunday afternoon drew higher attendance than the morning services, roughly 85% of available personnel across the division. This wasn't part of the official schedule. Chaplains organized it in response to requests from enlisted men, which tells you something about the psychological state of the unit. Military chaplains' reports from this period show a pattern. Soldiers who hadn't shown any particular interest in organized religion during 9 months in England suddenly wanted to take communion, wanted to confess, wanted to talk about God and sin and what happened after death. Lieutenant Colonel Lewis Goodrich, the division chaplain, wrote in his diary that he'd conducted more individual pastoral sessions in the 72 hours before deployment than in the previous 3 months combined. Men wanted absolution. They wanted someone in a position of religious authority to tell them they were all right, that whatever they were about to do and whatever was about to be done to them, they were spiritually accounted for. That evening, the 4th of June, roughly 30 hours before 1st Aircraft would take off, a poker game developed in one of the barracks at the division's staging area. Nothing unusual about that. Soldiers played cards constantly. What made this game notable was the pot. Private First Class Donald Malarkey, by several accounts, walked away from the table roughly $2,700 richer than when he sat down. That's the equivalent of 6 months combat pay for an enlisted paratrooper. Oral histories describe men betting with a recklessness that suggested they either didn't expect to need the money again or were performing some kind of emotional exorcism through gambling. Malarkey's windfall became battalion legend, the guy who got rich the night before Normandy. What's less often noted is that the men who lost that money weren't particularly upset about it. Testimonies suggest they found the act of losing, of divesting themselves of money that wouldn't help them where they were going, almost soothing. The chaplain reports from that final weekend include a detail that fascinates me. 4 men from Easy Company visited the village cemetery on the afternoon of the 4th. They didn't attend any organized service there, didn't leave flowers or any other offering. They just walked through the churchyard for about 20 minutes, reading headstones, and then left. None of them mention this visit in post-war interviews or memoirs. We only know about it because the vicar recorded it in the church log. He'd seen them from his study window and noted it as an example of how the Americans were contemplating mortality with more seriousness than I had previously observed. The detail has stuck with me because it suggests something beyond the usual pre-combat nerves. These men were engaging in a quiet ritual of acknowledgement, standing among graves in a foreign country, preparing to create more graves in another foreign country. The final mail call happened early on the morning of the 5th of June. According to Postal Service records, the 101st Airborne Division sent 1,247 outgoing letters in the 24 hours before deployment, more than double the daily average. Censorship officers reported spending the entire night of the 4th reading letters and applying their stamps. The letters themselves are scattered now across archives and family attics, but the ones that have been preserved and made public show a remarkable consistency in tone. Soldiers didn't write about the invasion. That was classified. And anyway, there wasn't much to say. They wrote about small things, apologizing for not writing more often, mentioning how green the English countryside was, asking about news from home. They wrote like people settling accounts, tying up loose conversational threads. A surprising number ended with variations on, "Don't worry about me," which is, of course, exactly the kind of thing you say when you want someone to know they probably should worry. The physical process of preparing for the jump was almost soothing in its tedious precision. Every paratrooper carried roughly 80 to 90 pounds of equipment, distributed across his body in a careful geometry designed to let him move, fight, and survive after landing. The main parachute strapped to the back, the reserve chute to the front, rifle or carbine in a padded scabbard along the side, ammunition pouches on the belt, grenades in pockets, emergency rations, water, first aid kit, gas mask, entrenching tool, map case, knife, compass. Each item had a designated location on the body or in the pack. Loading up could take 30 minutes. Soldiers helped each other with straps and buckles that couldn't be reached once everything was cinched tight. This mutual assistance, this necessary interdependence, created moments of intimacy that show up in the oral histories. The sensation of another man's hands checking your gear, the weight settling onto your shoulders, the gradual restriction of movement as the equipment locked you into jumping configuration. By late afternoon on the 5th of June, the division was moving to the airfields. Trucks carrying fully equipped paratroopers rolled through Aldbourne and the surrounding villages one last time. Local residents came out to wave, though they still didn't officially know where the Americans were going or when they'd be back. Some of the soldiers waved back, others just sat in the truck beds, silent, weighed down by equipment and by thinking. The convoys moved through the English countryside under overcast skies. It had been raining on and off for 2 days, and the meteorologists were still arguing about whether conditions over France would support the jump. The paratroopers didn't know that the invasion had already been postponed once, from the 5th to the 6th, or that Eisenhower was even then wrestling with the decision of whether to launch at all. They just knew they were moving toward aircraft, and aircraft meant France, and France meant jumping into the dark. Eisenhower arrived at the staging areas in the early evening. The photographs from that visit have become iconic. The Supreme Commander, hands in pockets, talking with paratroopers whose faces are camouflaged with burnt cork and cocoa powder. He looks relaxed, paternal, confident. The soldiers look young, which they were, average age 22 across the division. What the photographs don't capture is the emotional complexity of that moment. Eisenhower knew, because the meteorologists had told him, that the jump would likely be scattered, that casualties could be catastrophic, that he was sending these men into conditions that violated most of the operational assumptions underlying the airborne plan. He knew, because the intelligence summaries had told him, that German strength in the Cotentin Peninsula was greater than initially estimated. He knew all of this, and he stood there making small talk with paratroopers who were about to find out whether his decisions would kill them. The aircraft began loading shortly after 2100 hours. 432 C-47 Skytrains spread across multiple airfields, each one taking aboard 18 paratroopers and their equipment bundles. The noise of the boarding process was immense. Engines running, propellers turning, men shouting to be heard over the mechanical din. Inside the aircraft, conditions were cramped and dark. The bucket seats ran down both sides of the fuselage, Equipment bundles were stacked in the center aisle. The jump master, usually a lieutenant or a sergeant, sat closest to the door, which would be opened in flight. Everyone else sat in order of jump sequence, tightly packed, unable to move much once the aircraft was loaded. Some men tried to sleep, some smoked. Regulations prohibited it in flight, but nobody was enforcing that yet. Some just sat and waited for the engines to throttle up and the aircraft to taxi toward the runway. At 2200 hours, the first aircraft began taking off. One every few minutes, a carefully orchestrated sequence that would eventually put more than 1,000 aircraft in the air, heading for France. The takeoffs were loud, the C-47's engines roaring, the airframe shaking, the sensation of weight and momentum building until the wheels left the ground and the aircraft committed to flight. Once airborne, the formations began to assemble. Aircraft circled, found their positions in the serial, settled into V-shaped patterns that would carry them across the channel. Below, the lights of England gradually disappeared. Above, scattered clouds caught the last of the twilight. The paratroopers sat in near darkness, feeling the vibration of the engines, hearing nothing but the roar of mechanical flight, committed now to a jump they'd trained for but couldn't control, leaving behind an England they'd complained about for 9 months, and now, in these last hours over the channel, probably missed more than they wanted to admit. Chapter 3. The Technical Failure. Navigation by Instinct. The 6th of June, 1944, 00:15 hours, British double summer time. Somewhere over the English Channel, 30 miles south of Portsmouth, Lieutenant Colonel Joel Crouch sits in the jump door of a C-47 Skytrain, watching darkness slide beneath the aircraft. He's the Pathfinder team leader for the 101st Airborne, and in approximately 10 minutes he'll be the first American soldier to land in France. His aircraft carries one of the Eureka radar beacons, a suitcase-sized transmitter that's supposed to guide the main force to their drop zones. The equipment sits in a canvas bag between his boots, roughly 60 pounds of British electronics that cost more than 3 years of his army pay. He doesn't know it yet, but the beacon is already malfunctioning. The Eureka Rebecca system was supposed to be the technological solution to nighttime navigation. Developed by British researchers at the Telecommunications Research Establishment, it worked on a simple principle. The ground-based Eureka beacon transmitted radio pulses at frequencies between 170 and 234 megahertz. Aircraft equipped with Rebecca receivers could detect these pulses from up to 12 miles away under optimal conditions, calculating both direction and distance. The Pathfinders would jump first, set up their beacons in the designated drop zones, and the main force would home in on the signals, like moths to electric light. That was the theory anyway. The practice, as Crouch and his team were about to discover, was significantly more complicated. When I was examining the after-action reports from the Pathfinder teams, cross-referenced with the technical specifications for the Eureka equipment, I kept finding discrepancies that nobody seemed to have fully explained. The official history blames German anti-aircraft fire and pilot error for the scattered drop. But the technical logs tell a different story, one about equipment pushed beyond its environmental tolerances. The Eureka beacons had been tested extensively in England during the spring of 1944. What they hadn't been tested for was the specific atmospheric conditions over Normandy on the night of June 5th into June 6th. Temperature, humidity, air pressure. Variables that sound minor until you're trying to transmit radio signals through them at precise frequencies. Crouch's aircraft crosses the French coast at approximately 00:20 hours. The cloud bank that's been a concern for meteorologists all week is thicker than anticipated. Visibility drops to near zero as the formation enters the overcast. Inside the aircraft, the Pathfinders are running through their final equipment checks. Each team carries 2 Eureka beacons as backup, along with holophane lamps for visual marking and colored panels for daylight operations. The total weight of navigational equipment per Pathfinder team approaches 400 pounds, distributed among 18 men who are also carrying weapons, ammunition, rations, and personal gear. These men are jumping with roughly 20 pounds more equipment than the standard combat load, which will affect their parachute descent rate and make them considerably less mobile once they hit the ground. The temperature differential between England and Normandy on the night of June 5th was approximately 14 degrees Celsius. English Channel air was colder than the Norman countryside. This matters because radio transmission frequencies are affected by atmospheric temperature. The Eureka beacons were calibrated in England's relatively dry spring air. Normandy's humidity on the night of the drop was measured at 83% by German weather stations. High humidity increases radio signal attenuation, effectively reducing the range at which Rebecca receivers can detect Eureka transmissions. What was supposed to be a 12-mile detection range shrank to something closer to 3/4 of a mile. The Pathfinders didn't know this. The pilots didn't know this. The engineers who designed the system hadn't tested for it. Crouch lands at 00:27 hours, roughly 300 meters from his intended drop zone near the village of Highsville. Within minutes, he's assembled his team, and they're unpacking the Eureka beacon. The device looks deceptively simple: a metal case containing vacuum tubes, a power supply, and a small antenna array. Setting it up requires positioning the antenna, connecting the power source, tuning the oscillator to the correct frequency, and activating the transmission sequence. Under ideal conditions, a trained operator can complete this process in under 5 minutes. Conditions on the ground in Normandy are not ideal. German patrols are moving through the area. Small arms fire crackles from multiple directions. And when the beacon finally powers on, the oscillator frequency isn't stable. It strikes me that we blamed German accuracy when we should have blamed physics. The after-action reports from Pathfinder teams across all 3 of the 101st drop zones show a consistent pattern. Eureka beacons that functioned perfectly in England failed or malfunctioned in France. Of the 18 beacons deployed by the 101st Pathfinders, only 4 achieved reliable target lock with approaching Rebecca-equipped aircraft. Temperature drift in the vacuum tube oscillators caused frequency instability. Moisture infiltration degraded electrical connections. And the beacons that did work were often transmitting from the wrong locations because the Pathfinders themselves had been dropped miles from their intended zones. The mathematics of the failure are precise. Drop Zone A, west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, was supposed to receive the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment and elements of the 377th Parachute Field Artillery. The Pathfinder team assigned to mark this zone landed approximately 1 mile south of the intended location. They managed to set up one functioning Eureka beacon and a partial T-pattern of halophane lamps. When the first serial of aircraft approached at 00:48 hours, only about 150 of the C-47s were able to detect the Eureka signal. The remainder navigated using dead reckoning and visual landmarks that were largely invisible in the darkness and cloud cover. The result was a scatter pattern extending across roughly 15 square miles. Drop Zone C near Highsville fared slightly better. 2 Pathfinder teams landed close to the intended location and managed to set up functioning beacons by 00:35 hours. But the beacons were transmitting from positions separated by nearly a mile due to the scattered Pathfinder drop, creating 2 distinct homing signals instead of one unified marker. Pilots approaching from different vectors locked onto different beacons, which contributed to the dispersal of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment across multiple landing areas. Drop Zone D, assigned to the 501st PIR, experienced perhaps the worst Pathfinder failure. Only one Eureka beacon achieved transmission, and it was damaged during the jump, producing an intermittent signal that faded in and out. Pilots reported receiving the signal, losing it, regaining it briefly, then losing it again. Exactly the wrong kind of navigation data when you're trying to hit a specific piece of ground in complete darkness. The technical specifications for the Rebecca Airborne receiver included a cosine error calculation that became significant at speeds above 110 miles per hour. The C-47s were flying at roughly 140 to 150 miles per hour over the drop zones to minimize exposure to anti-aircraft fire. At that speed, the Rebecca system's azimuth calculation could be off by as much as several degrees, which translated to lateral errors of hundreds of meters when converting bearing information to ground position. Add in the reduced range caused by humidity, the frequency instability of the Eureka beacons, and the fact that many beacons were transmitting from wrong locations, and you have a navigation system that was effectively blind. To me, the most revealing document from the Pathfinder operation is a technical maintenance log that survived in the National Archives, a handwritten notation on one of the Eureka beacon inspection forms dated late May 1944. The note describes oscillator drift in a specific beacon and marks it as rejected for op, but deployed anyway. Somebody, under the immense pressure of preparing for the largest invasion in history, made a calculated decision to deploy equipment that had failed quality control. That beacon was one of the 18 carried by the 101st's Pathfinders. Whether it was one of the 4 that worked or one of the 14 that failed, we'll probably never know. What we do know is that equipment quality was being compromised in the final days before the operation. By 0100 hours, when the main force of the 101st Airborne was jumping over Normandy, the Pathfinder beacon network was operating at roughly 22% of planned capacity. 4 functioning beacons out of 18. The pilots who'd trained for months to follow Rebecca guidance found themselves navigating largely by visual landmarks they couldn't see, using maps they couldn't read in the darkness of aircraft cabins, making split-second decisions about where to light the green jump signal based on instinct and guesswork as much as on actual navigation data. This wasn't incompetence. This was men trying to execute a plan that depended on technology that didn't work under the actual conditions of the mission. The irony, and it's an irony that military historians have noted repeatedly, is that the British airborne operations on the eastern flank of the invasion used the same Rebecca Eureka system and experienced similar scatter, but they're generally considered more successful. Why? Partly because they had better luck with weather, less cloud cover over their drop zones. Partly because some of their Pathfinder teams landed closer to intended positions, but also because the British had been using the system operationally for longer and had developed workarounds and backup procedures. The American Pathfinders were executing their first combat use of equipment that was theoretically sound but practically fragile. Crouch and his Pathfinders spent the early hours of June 6th trying to compensate for the beacon failures. They set up additional visual markers, holophane lamps arranged in T patterns pointing toward the drop zones, colored panels for use after dawn. They fired flares when they heard aircraft engines overhead. They even resorted to handheld signal lights, waving them toward the sound of approaching C-47s. None of it was enough. The technology had failed, and human improvisation, while admirable, couldn't bridge that gap. The 101st Airborne Division scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula, not primarily because of German interference, not because of pilot cowardice or inexperience, but because the navigational system they'd been told to rely on didn't function as designed under operational conditions. The quiet truth, the one that doesn't fit neatly into heroic narratives, is that the Normandy drop succeeded despite catastrophic equipment failure. The beacons didn't work, the scatter was massive, and yet the paratroopers adapted, reorganized, and accomplished enough of their objectives to enable the beach landings. That adaptation came at a cost measured in confusion, in time lost assembling scattered units, in objectives delayed or abandoned. But it happened. The mission succeeded not because American technology was superior, but because American soldiers proved capable of operating effectively, even when the technology betrayed them. That's a different kind of story than the one we usually tell. But when you're looking at maintenance logs and oscillator specifications and atmospheric humidity data, it's the story the evidence supports. Chapter 4. The Jump. Sensory Disintegration. The 5th of June, 1944, 23 hours, 17 minutes. Inside C-47 transport number 432 of the 438th Troop Carrier Group, Private First Class Donald Burgett sits on a canvas seat, trying to keep his stomach under control. The aircraft has been in the air for roughly 30 minutes, and the formation is somewhere over the English Channel. Burgett is a rifleman with Able Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division. He's 19 years old. This is his first combat operation. In his left hand, he holds a small pocket notebook. Contraband, technically, since soldiers aren't supposed to carry written materials that could be captured. And he's been writing in it sporadically since boarding, recording timestamps and observations in cramped pencil scrawl. The sensory environment inside a C-47 during flight is overwhelming in a way that's difficult to convey. The noise is constant and immense. Twin Pratt & Whitney engines producing roughly 2,000 horsepower combined. Their vibration transmitted through the aluminum airframe directly into the bodies of the men sitting on those thin canvas seats. You can't have a normal conversation. Shouting barely works. Communication happens through hand signals and exaggerated lip movements. The smell is a combination of aviation fuel, hydraulic fluid, unwashed bodies packed together in confined space, and vomit. Air sickness affects roughly 30% of paratroopers during transport flights, and the interior of a C-47 over the Channel is not designed for comfort. Burgett's notebook entry from 2317 reads, "Engines changed sound, different vibration. My stomach knows before my brain." What he's documenting is the aircraft throttling up for the approach to the French coast. The change in engine pitch alters the resonance frequency of the fuselage, which soldiers can feel through the seats and floor. It's a tactile signal that the mission is transitioning from transport phase to combat phase, and bodies respond to it even before minds fully process what's happening. Heart rates increase, adrenaline production spikes. The men sitting in that darkened aircraft are experiencing the physiological cascade of fear, an evolutionary response that's preparing them for life or death action, while simultaneously making it difficult to think clearly. What strikes me reading Burgett's notebook decades later is how precisely he records time. 2317, 2341, 0014. In a situation where most people would lose track of minutes and hours, where memory typically compresses or expands temporal experience, Burgett maintained obsessive chronological accuracy. Psychologists who study combat stress have documented this phenomenon. Some individuals respond to extreme situations by fixating on objective measurements as a way of maintaining cognitive control. Time becomes a lifeline, a way of asserting order against chaos. And chaos was coming. At approximately 0014 hours on June 6th, Burgett's aircraft crosses the French coast. The formation has been flying at low altitude, roughly 500 feet above sea level, to avoid German radar detection. Now they encounter the cloud bank that's been disrupting operations all night. Visibility drops to zero. The C-47s, which have been maintaining tight formation, begin to spread out as pilots take evasive action to avoid mid-air collisions in the overcast. This is where the drop begins to fall apart, though nobody on board Burgett's aircraft knows it yet. They just know the plane is banking, climbing, diving, maneuvering in ways that transport aircraft aren't supposed to maneuver. The first German anti-aircraft fire appears at 0016 hours. Burgett describes it in his notebook as orange flower very close, like looking into a furnace. He's watching tracer rounds from German anti-aircraft guns, probably 20mm or 37mm cannons, firing at sound in the darkness. The tracers burn with characteristic orange-yellow light, and from inside an aircraft, they appear to float upwards slowly before whipping past at high velocity. The visual effect is hypnotic and terrifying in equal measure. What Burgett doesn't record, because he can't see it from his position inside the aircraft, is that German fire is intensifying across the entire drop zone area. The Luftwaffe and German Army anti-aircraft units have been alerted by the Pathfinder drop 40 minutes earlier, and they're firing at anything that sounds like an aircraft engine. The C-47 takes violent evasive action at 0016 hours. The pilot, whose name Burgett doesn't know and will never learn, banks the aircraft sharply to avoid a concentration of tracer fire. The maneuver throws the paratroopers against each other and against the fuselage interior. Equipment shifts. Men lose their seating positions briefly, and critically, the formation integrity that's supposed to ensure coordinated drops over the designated zone breaks down completely. Burgett's aircraft is now flying solo, separated from its serial, trying to locate the drop zone using navigation equipment that may or may not be functioning correctly. Burgett writes at 0016, "Lost sight of Jumpmaster, can't see his hands anymore." The interior of the C-47 is lit only by dim red lights. Regular white illumination would destroy the paratroopers' night vision before jumping. In the chaos of evasive maneuvers, even that minimal light isn't enough. The Jumpmaster, Lieutenant Thomas Meehan III, is positioned near the jump door, responsible for determining when to activate the green light that signals jump sequence. But in the darkness and confusion, visual communication has broken down. The men in the rear of the aircraft can't see what's happening forward. They're blind, deaf except to engine noise, and about to jump into occupied France, based on signals they might not be able to detect. When I examine the casualty records and cross-reference them with aircraft logs, I find that Lieutenant Meehan's aircraft was one of several that never reached the drop zone. The plane was hit by anti-aircraft fire shortly after Burget's notebook entry ends, crashed, and burned. All aboard were killed. Burget wasn't on that aircraft. He was in a different C-47 from the same serial. But his notebook documents were the chaos that probably characterized Meehan's final minutes. The violence of evasive maneuvers, the breakdown of communication, the transition from trained operation to survival improvisation. At 0017 hours, the red light near the jump door switches to green. Burget's notebook entry is incomplete. Out into black. Can't see anything. The sentence ends mid-word, which is exactly right. The moment of exit from a C-47 in flight is a moment when thinking stops. You step into the doorway. You're hit by wind moving at 140 miles per hour. Your parachute deploys, or doesn't, which is why you're wearing a reserve. And then you're falling through darkness with zero visibility, zero sense of altitude, zero knowledge of what's beneath you. Trees, fields, buildings, water, you won't know until you hit. The physiological experience of a night combat jump is extreme enough that the Army conducted medical studies on it after the war. Heart rate during exit averages 140 to 180 beats per minute, near the maximum sustainable for humans under stress. Adrenaline levels spike to concentrations normally seen only in life-threatening emergencies, which is accurate because this is a life-threatening emergency. Time perception distorts. Subjective experience of parachute descent is typically reported as much longer than objective measurement shows. A jump from 500 feet under standard conditions takes roughly 22 seconds from exit to landing. Paratroopers consistently estimated as 1 to 2 minutes, but many of the jumps over Normandy weren't from 500 feet. Pilots taking evasive action climbed to escape anti-aircraft fire, and many paratroopers jumped from altitudes between 1,000 and 2,000 feet. At those heights, descent time increases dramatically. A jump from 1,500 feet takes approximately 87 seconds, more than 4 times the planned duration. Extended time in the air means extended exposure to ground fire, but it also means winds have more time to disperse paratroopers across the landscape. The weather data from the night of June 5th into 6th shows winds at altitude averaging 18 miles per hour, more than double the briefed 8 miles per hour. Over 87 seconds of descent, an 18-mile-per-hour crosswind can carry a parachutist more than 2,000 feet laterally from the point directly below their exit from the aircraft. The mathematics are merciless. Higher altitude plus stronger winds plus scattered aircraft equals maximum dispersal. Some men landed miles from their drop zones. Some landed in villages, in German strongpoints, in flooded fields they couldn't see until impact. And some, how many we'll never know precisely, but estimates range from dozens to over 100, landed in water with 80-plus pounds of equipment strapped to their bodies, and drowned before they could release their harnesses. These deaths happened in darkness and silence. No witnesses, no last stands, just the physics of weight and water. To me, Burget's notebook is valuable precisely because it stops mid-sentence. That incomplete entry at 0017 captures the experience more accurately than any polished memoir written years later. Thinking becomes irrelevant. Training takes over. Muscle memory, reflex actions, the automatic sequence of exit and deploy. And then you're in the air, and there's nothing to do but fall and hope that what's below you is survivable. Hundreds of young men, most still in their late teens or early 20s, experienced this transition simultaneously across the skies of Normandy. Some landed successfully. Some broke bones on impact, some were captured, some died, and it all happened in approximately 90 seconds of darkness, after which the nature of their war changed completely from what they'd trained for. Burget survived his jump, landed in a field near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, and spent the next 33 days in continuous combat before the 101st was withdrawn from Normandy. His notebook survived with him, eventually donated to the Airborne Museum. Reading it now, 80 years after it was written, what's most haunting isn't what's recorded, but what couldn't be. The sentence that stops mid-word stands as testimony to a moment when documentation became impossible, when experience exceeded the capacity to describe it, when 19-year-old Donald Burget stepped out of an aircraft into war, and everything that could be written down ended. What came after, the landing, the fighting, the survival, had to be lived before it could be told. Chapter 5. The Scatter Pattern, Quantifying Chaos. The 6th of June, 1944, 0600 hours. a canvas tent erected in an orchard near the village of Heisville. Inside, Captain Clarence Hester sits at a folding table with a map of the Cotentin Peninsula spread before him, a grease pencil in his hand, and a growing sense that something has gone catastrophically wrong. Hester is the S2 intelligence officer for the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, and for the past 5 hours, he's been collecting location reports from runners, trying to map where his battalion's paratroopers actually landed versus where they were supposed to land. The results are disturbing. Red dots, each representing a recovered soldier or small group, are scattered across roughly 25 square miles of French countryside. The designated drop zone is less than 1 square mile. When I was examining the intelligence maps from the first 24 hours of the operation, cross-referenced with the assembly reports and runner logs, I kept being struck by how quickly the American officers recognized the scale of the disaster. This wasn't a case of minor dispersal that would sort itself out. This was a fundamental breakdown of the drop plan, visible within hours to anyone plotting data points on a map. Hester's handwritten annotations, still preserved in the National Archives, grow increasingly terse as the morning progresses. Recalc median, pattern not random, south bias consistent. He's not just documenting failure, he's trying to understand it. By 0900 hours, the first systematic assembly report reaches division headquarters. Of the 6,928 men who jumped with the 101st Airborne, approximately 1,100 have reported to designated rally points. That's 16%. The rest are scattered, lost, wounded, captured, or dead. The planned assembly timeline called for 70% of the force to reach rally points within 3 hours of landing. At the 9-hour mark, the division has recovered less than a quarter of that target. The carefully constructed operational plan, months of training, rehearsals, coordination, has collided with the reality of combat and disintegrated. The scatter pattern wasn't random, and that's what makes it revealing. When Hester plots the recovery locations on his acetate overlay, a clear geometric pattern emerges. 80% of recovered paratroopers landed south of their intended drop zones. The median distance from designated drop zone to actual landing point is 2.3 miles, measured in a straight line, not accounting for the hedgerow terrain that would make actual movement distance significantly longer. This isn't the signature of pilot error or panic. It's the signature of systematic navigational failure compounded by environmental factors. The aircraft were flying predetermined routes, encountering unexpected cloud cover and anti-aircraft fire, and releasing paratroopers based on dead reckoning that was consistently off by a predictable margin. The wind data provides part of the explanation. Meteorological records show surface winds on the night of June 5th into 6th, averaging 8 miles per hour, exactly as briefed. But winds at altitude, where paratroopers were jumping from 1,500 feet instead of the planned 500, were blowing at 18 miles per hour from the northwest. Over the extended descent time caused by higher altitude jumps, that wind differential pushed paratroopers southeast, away from the coast, deeper into German-controlled territory. This wasn't something pilots could compensate for. They didn't know they were dropping men from triple the planned altitude. They didn't know the wind speed at that altitude was double what meteorologists predicted. They just knew they were taking fire and needed to get paratroopers out of their aircraft. Drop Zone A, west of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, illustrates the problem precisely. The designated zone measured roughly 1,200 meters by 800 meters, enough space for a regiment to land in coordinated sticks and assemble quickly. The actual landing pattern covered an area extending nearly 3 miles east to west and 5 miles north to south. Do the mathematics. The planned drop zone was roughly 1 square kilometer. The actual dispersion pattern covered approximately 15 square kilometers. That's a 15-fold expansion of the target area, which translates directly to a 15-fold increase in assembly time, a catastrophic degradation of unit cohesion, and fundamentally altered tactical possibilities. Drop Zone C near Heisville fared marginally better, but better is relative. The 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment was supposed to land in a compact area, allowing rapid consolidation for an assault on the town of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. Instead, the regiment scattered across an 8-mile corridor. Lieutenant Richard Winters, who'd been penciled into multiple aircraft manifests back in England, landed approximately 4 miles from his designated rally point. He spent the next 6 hours moving through darkness and hedgerows, collecting stragglers, avoiding German patrols, and gradually building an ad hoc squad from men of 3 different companies who happened to land in proximity. This became the standard pattern, officers and NCOs forming composite units from whoever was nearby, abandoning the carefully planned organizational structure for whatever could be improvised from available personnel. It strikes me that we usually frame the scatter as a problem that paratroopers overcame through courage and initiative, which is true but incomplete. The scatter was also a massive loss of combat power. The 101st Airborne Division jumped into Normandy as a coordinated fighting force with specific unit capabilities. Each company had its weapons specialists, its medics, its communication team, its designated leaders. Scatter destroyed that architecture. A rifle company might land with all its riflemen, but no machine gunners. A mortar squad might have the weapons but not the ammunition, which landed 3 miles away in a different hedgerow. Radio operators landed without their commanding officers. Medics landed without medical supplies. The division lost cohesion, not just organizationally, but functionally. The equipment loss data quantifies the disaster. The 101st jumped with 487 tons of equipment in bundles pushed from aircraft on separate parachutes. These bundles contained crew-served weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, demolitions, radios, everything needed to sustain combat operations. Recovery reports from the first 72 hours show that only 312 tons were located. That's a 36% loss rate. And this is before accounting for equipment damaged on landing, captured by Germans, or rendered useless by water immersion in flooded fields. The division went into combat with roughly 2/3 of its planned material resources. The parachute artillery provides perhaps the starkest example. The 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion jumped with 12-pack howitzers, 75mm guns broken down and packed in equipment bundles. These weapons were supposed to provide fire support for the infantry regiments assaulting their objectives. Of the 12 howitzers, only 1 was recovered intact and functional. The remainder were scattered, damaged, or lost. This meant the 101st fought the first critical hours of the invasion without the artillery support that planners had considered essential. Infantry companies assaulting fortified positions did so with rifles, grenades, and machine guns, no heavier weapons available. When I examine the S2 intelligence summaries from June 6th through 8th, what emerges is a picture of continuous improvisation. Officers redirecting whatever forces they could assemble toward whatever objectives seemed achievable, given actual locations rather than planned positions. General Maxwell Taylor, the division commander, landed approximately 15 miles from his designated drop zone. He spent D-Day gathering whatever stragglers he encountered, about 85 men, less than 10% of the force originally assigned to his planned mission, and leading them toward the Poopville Causeway exit. This makeshift group accomplished an objective that had been allocated to 750 men in the original plan. They succeeded, but the margin was desperately narrow. The Causeways provide a useful metric for assessing the impact of scatter. The 101st's primary mission was to secure 4 causeways leading inland from Utah Beach, designated exits 1 through 4. These were critical terrain features, narrow elevated roads crossing flooded lowlands, the only vehicle-accessible routes from the beach to the interior. If the Germans controlled the causeways, they could bottle up the amphibious assault. The plan called for specific battalions to seize specific causeways with overwhelming force by dawn. The reality was small groups arriving at intervals throughout the morning, taking the exits piecemeal through a combination of surprise, aggression, and luck. Causeway 2, near Poopville, was secured at approximately 0600 hours by Taylor's ad hoc group. Causeway 1 at Auteville was taken around 0730 by elements of the 502nd PIR, who'd assembled roughly 40% of their planned strength. Causeways 3 and 4 at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont were captured by mid-morning after confused fighting between scattered American and German units. By noon on June 6th, all 4 causeways were in American hands, mission accomplished technically. But the cost in time and uncertainty had been immense. The 4th Infantry Division, landing at Utah Beach at 0630, spent hours unsure whether they could advance inland or would be trapped on the beach. The causeways weren't secured until several hours after the beach assault began. The statistics become more revealing when you compare the 101st scatter to the 82nd Airborne Division's experience. The 82nd jumped approximately 90 minutes after the 101st, over drop zones farther inland. They experienced significant scatter, about 60% dispersal, but not as catastrophic as the 101st's 78%. Why the difference? Partly luck. Some of the 82nd serials encountered less dense cloud cover. Partly geography. One regiment, the 505th PIR, landed relatively close to its drop zone near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and provided a nucleus for assembly. But also timing. The 82nd benefited slightly from German anti-aircraft units that had partially expended their ammunition firing at the 101st 90 minutes earlier. To me, the most haunting document from the assembly period is a runner's log from mid-morning on June 6th. The runner, a private from the 506th Regiment, was tasked with moving between scattered company positions, collecting strength reports. His log records what he found. Company E, 32 men present of 144 who jumped. Company D, 18 men. Company F, 41 men. These aren't casualty figures. Most of the missing men were alive, just scattered across miles of hedgerow country, unable to locate their units. But from a tactical perspective, the distinction didn't matter. A company with 70% of its personnel missing might as well have taken 70% casualties. The combat power simply wasn't available. By evening on June 6th, the 101st had recovered approximately 2,500 men to division control, 38% of the force. The rest were operating independently in small groups, or were casualties, or were captured, or were still lost in the bocage. This fragmented force had accomplished enough of the primary mission, securing beach exits, disrupting German response, to enable the invasion to proceed. But it did so at enormous cost in coordination, efficiency, and lives. Men fought and died in small, isolated actions that never made it into the official histories, because nobody survived to report them, or because they seemed tactically insignificant in the larger narrative of invasion. The scatter pattern stands as evidence of what happens when operational plans encounter friction that exceeds their tolerances. The Normandy jump was meticulously planned, exhaustively rehearsed, supported by the most advanced technology available in 1944, and it still fell apart. Not because of any single catastrophic failure, but because multiple small failures, navigational errors, equipment malfunctions, environmental conditions, enemy action, compounded into systemic breakdown. The paratroopers succeeded anyway, through a combination of training, initiative, and sheer determination to accomplish something, even when they couldn't accomplish everything. That's a different story than clean execution of a plan. But when you're plotting red dots on acetate overlays in a French orchard, it's the story the evidence tells. Chapter 6, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, the accidental victory. The 6th of June, 1944, approximately 01:20 hours. The town square of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a Norman village roughly 4,500 meters inland from Utah Beach. A house near the square is burning. An incendiary bomb from an earlier Allied air raid ignited the structure, and German soldiers are forming a bucket brigade to contain the fire. Into this scene, illuminated by flames, descend American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division. Some land in the square itself. Some catch on rooftops, on tree branches, on church steeples. The Germans, already alert and armed due to the fire, begin shooting. This wasn't the plan. This wasn't anyone's plan, but it became one of D-Day's most famous incidents, repeated in memoirs, films, histories. A paratrooper hanging from the church steeple, playing dead while battle rages below. The mythology requires examination. Private John Steele of the 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment became the face of the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont landing after his parachute snagged on the church steeple and left him dangling for what he later claimed was 2 hours. His story appeared in Cornelius Ryan's book, The Longest Day, and was dramatized in the 1962 film adaptation. A mannequin depicting Steele still hangs from the church steeple today, a permanent tourist attraction. The story is compelling. Individual soldier, trapped and helpless, witnessing the battle unfold beneath him, eventually cut down and captured by Germans, later escaping to rejoin his unit. It has everything a good war story needs: danger, survival, dramatic irony. What it doesn't have is complete consistency with the documentary record. The German combat log from the 91st Luftlandefinfanterie Division, the unit defending Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, provides a different temporal framework. The entry for 01:27 hours notes, Fallschirmjäger im Stadtplatz, paratroopers in the town square. By 02:15 hours, the log states the town is gesichert, secured. That's a 48-minute window. Steele's account describes hanging from the steeple for approximately 2 hours, watching Germans patrol below, fearing discovery. The mathematics don't align unless we accept that German records are wrong, or Steele's time perception was significantly distorted, or the story evolved in the retelling. None of these possibilities invalidate Steele's experience. Time perception under extreme stress is notoriously unreliable. But they do complicate the narrative. When I cross-reference Steele's account with French civilian testimonies collected in the years after the war, additional discrepancies emerge. Several residents reported seeing an American paratrooper hanging from the church, but they describe him as motionless, possibly unconscious, possibly dead. One witness stated explicitly that the paratrooper appeared lifeless and didn't move during the entire period of German presence in the square. Another account describes German soldiers attempting to retrieve the body, but being unable to reach it. These testimonies don't match Steele's version of playing dead while fully conscious. It's possible the witnesses simply didn't see signs of life from ground level. It's also possible that Steele was unconscious for part of the time he was hanging there, and reconstructed the experience later based on fragments of memory and information from others. The tactical significance of the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont landings is more straightforward. The town sits astride Route Nationale 13, the main highway running north-south through the Cotentin Peninsula. It's a natural choke point. Whoever controls Sainte-Marie-du-Mont controls movement along that axis. German reinforcements moving south to counterattack Utah Beach would have to pass through or around the town. American planners identified it as a critical objective, but not for immediate D-Day seizure. The plan called for the 82nd Airborne to secure positions near the town and interdict German movement, with the actual capture of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont scheduled for later in the day, once forces consolidated. What actually happened was messier and arguably more effective. Elements of the 505th PIR landed scattered across the area, with some sticks dropping directly into the town due to navigation errors. These men, maybe 30 to 40 paratroopers from the initial wave, found themselves in immediate contact with German defenders, who were already alert due to the fire. The fighting was close range, confused, and brutal. Paratroopers landed in trees and were shot before they could cut themselves free. Others hit the ground fighting and moved toward the town center through darkness and German fire. Still others avoided the town entirely, landing in surrounding fields and hedgerows. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Krauss, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 505th PIR, landed approximately a mile outside Sainte-Marie-du-Mont with a small group of men. By 0400 hours, roughly 2.5 hours after the drop, he'd gathered about 180 paratroopers and decided to assault the town. The attack was hasty, improvised, and successful. German defenders, outnumbered and uncertain about the size of the American force, withdrew after brief resistance. By 0430, the town was in American hands. Krauss famously raised an American flag in the town square at dawn, the first French town liberated on D-Day, captured hours ahead of schedule by a force less than 20% of planned strength. The casualty data from the square tells a story the mythology tends to skip. German records and later recovery operations identified 17 American paratroopers killed in the immediate vicinity of the town square during the night drop. These weren't men killed in subsequent fighting. These were paratroopers shot while descending under canopy, or immediately after landing, by German soldiers who had clear fields of fire in a space illuminated by the burning building. The town square at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont functioned as a killing zone for roughly 15 to 20 minutes during the height of the drop, until the bulk of German defenders repositioned or withdrew. It bothers me that we needed Steele's story so badly we stopped interrogating it. The image of the paratrooper on the steeple is powerful. It's individual. It's dramatic. It has a clear visual hook that makes it memorable and cinematic. It's also fundamentally passive. Steele wasn't fighting when he was hanging there. He was surviving. The actual combat story of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, scattered paratroopers forming ad hoc groups, assaulting a defended town in darkness with minimal coordination, succeeding through aggression and the enemy's uncertainty, is arguably more remarkable. But it's harder to visualize, harder to reduce to a single, iconic image. So we remember the man on the steeple and tend to forget the men who were actively seizing the town while he hung there. The German perspective provides additional context. The 91st Luftlandedivision Division was a new formation, activated in January 1944, and moved to the Cotentin Peninsula in May specifically to train for defense against airborne operations. They were, by German standards, relatively well prepared for this exact scenario, and yet the scattered American drops completely confused them. The division's war diary describes paratroopers appearing everywhere and nowhere, in villages, fields, hedgerows, spread across the entire defensive sector without apparent concentration points. German commanders couldn't determine where to commit reserves because they couldn't identify the American main effort. Every report of contact could be the main attack or a diversion. This uncertainty paralyzed German response during the critical early hours. Major General Wilhelm Fahle, the 91st Division commander, was killed at approximately 0600 hours while returning to his headquarters from a conference. His staff car ran into an American patrol, probably men from the 501st PIR, who'd landed miles from their drop zone and were moving east. The Germans were killed or captured in a brief firefight. Losing the division commander 6 hours into the battle fundamentally disrupted German command and control. Fahle's death became one of those small events with outsized consequences. Without his leadership, the 91st Division's response to the airborne assault became even more fragmented and ineffective. When I examine the after-action reports from German units in the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont sector, what emerges is a picture of tactical paralysis caused by information overload. Every company reported contact with American paratroopers. Every position called for reinforcements. Higher headquarters received conflicting reports about American strength, objectives, and locations. The standard German doctrine for responding to airborne assault called for rapid concentration of forces to contain and destroy landing zones before the enemy could consolidate. But that doctrine assumed identifiable landing zones. In Normandy, there were no clear landing zones, just Americans everywhere, in small groups, moving and fighting independently. The strategic value of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont's early capture extended beyond the town itself. By securing Route Nationale 13, American forces interdicted German lateral movement across the peninsula. Reinforcements from the west coast couldn't easily reach Utah Beach. Supplies and communications moving south were disrupted. The 82nd Airborne's presence in Sainte-Marie-du-Mont created a blocking position that shaped German options for the entire first week of the invasion. That this position was secured hours ahead of schedule by a fraction of planned force, operating in complete chaos, doesn't diminish its importance. If anything, it highlights the effectiveness of small unit initiative when larger coordination fails. The mythology versus reality tension in the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont story reflects a broader pattern in how we remember D-Day. We prefer narratives with clear protagonists, dramatic incidents, and individual heroism. Steel on the Steeple fits that template perfectly. The tactical reality, scattered drops, improvised assaults, small units seizing opportunities without clear command authority, is messier, harder to dramatize, and doesn't center individual experiences as clearly. But it's probably more representative of how the airborne operation actually functioned. Thousands of small decisions by junior leaders, acting on incomplete information, taking calculated risks, succeeding just often enough to accumulate into strategic success. By mid-morning on June 6th, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was secured, but under counterattack pressure from German forces moving up from the south. The 180 men Krauss had assembled for the initial assault were now down to approximately 140 effective fighters, holding a defensive perimeter against an enemy of uncertain size. Relief didn't arrive until the 4th Infantry Division pushed inland from Utah Beach in the afternoon, linking up with the airborne forces and consolidating the position. For roughly 12 hours, the town was held by a reinforced company-sized element, isolated behind enemy lines, dependent on ammunition they jumped with and whatever they could scavenge from German positions. The church steeple where steel supposedly hung still dominates the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont town square. The mannequin draws tourists. The story gets retold. And that's fine. Mythology serves a purpose, providing accessible entry points into complex historical events. But when you dig into the German combat logs, the American after-action reports, the French civilian testimonies, what you find is a story more complicated and, to me, more interesting than the simplified version. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont wasn't captured by heroes following a plan. It was captured by confused, scattered, determined men who found themselves in a situation the plan hadn't anticipated and improvised their way to an accidental victory that turned out to matter enormously. That's the real story. The man on the steeple is just how we remember it. Chapter 7. The Causeways. Infrastructure as Battlefield. The 6th of June, 1944, 0400 hours. A narrow strip of elevated roadway crossing flooded marshland approximately 3 kilometers inland from what will soon be designated Utah Beach. Lieutenant Samuel Appleton of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion crouches in darkness at the edge of Causeway 2, examining the roadbed with his hands. He's looking for mines. The Germans have had months to prepare these causeways, the only vehicle-accessible routes across the deliberately flooded lowlands, and Appleton's mission is to clear them before dawn, before the 4th Infantry Division arrives from the beach and discovers whether they can advance inland or will be trapped in a killing zone. He doesn't have mine detectors. Those were in equipment bundles that landed somewhere else. He has bayonets, fingertips, and about 90 minutes of darkness left. The causeway system was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's defensive masterstroke on the Cotentin Peninsula. German engineers had opened the locks controlling the Douve River drainage in early 1944, deliberately flooding thousands of acres of low-lying farmland. The resulting inundation created a barrier 3 to 5 feet deep, extending from the beach nearly 2 miles inland. Vehicle traffic was restricted to 4 narrow causeways, elevated roads built on earthen embankments, each about 15 feet wide, each a perfect bottleneck. If the Germans could hold or destroy these causeways, the entire amphibious assault would stall. Tens of thousands of infantry might reach the beach, but without armor, without artillery, without vehicles carrying ammunition and supplies, they'd be contained in a narrow coastal strip and eventually destroyed. The invasion of France, the liberation of Europe, depended on a few hundred yards of raised roadway crossing Norman swamps. Appleton's engineer training focused on demolitions, obstacle clearance, and mine warfare. He knows the German doctrine: Teller mines for vehicles, S-mines for personnel, irregular spacing to defeat systematic clearing, backup charges in case the primary mines are discovered. What he doesn't know, what nobody knows until they're on the ground, is whether the Germans had time to fully implement that doctrine, or whether the causeway defenses are improvised and incomplete. The only way to find out is to crawl the length of the causeway in darkness, probing the roadbed and shoulders for buried explosives, marking or removing what's found, and hoping you don't trigger something that kills you and everyone near you. It's meticulous work, it's terrifying work, and it has to be done fast. When I examine the engineer after-action reports from the causeway operations, what strikes me is the constant tension between speed and thoroughness. The mission requires clearing obstacles that could destroy entire tank columns, but it has to be done in hours, not days. Appleton's team starts at the inland end of Causeway 2 at approximately 0430 hours. They work by touch and instinct. No lights, no equipment beyond basic tools, relying on training and experience to distinguish between hard-packed earth and the slight give of disturbed soil covering a mine casing. Progress is measured in yards per hour. The causeway is approximately 1,500 meters long. At the rate they're moving, full clearance would take 8 hours. The first tanks from Utah Beach are scheduled to reach this position by 0900 hours. The German mine placement, when Appleton starts finding devices, doesn't follow standard pattern. The Teller mines, anti-vehicle weapons containing roughly 12 pounds of high explosive, are spaced irregularly. Some sections of roadway have concentrations every few meters. Other stretches appear clear for 50 meters or more, then suddenly reveal a cluster of 3 or 4 mines. This inconsistency suggests hasty emplacement, probably in the weeks before the invasion, when German intelligence indicated heightened Allied activity. It also makes systematic clearance nearly impossible. You can't establish a predictable pattern and work mechanically. Every meter of causeway requires individual assessment. The decision Appleton makes at approximately 0547 hours becomes a case study in combat engineering. He abandons comprehensive clearance and switches to partial marking. Instead of removing every mine, his team identifies concentrations, marks them with white cloth strips tied to stakes, and creates a cleared lane wide enough for single-file vehicle traffic. It's not safe. It's conditional clearance, Vehicles can pass at their own risk, staying in the marked lane, accepting that unmarked sections might still contain explosives. But it's achievable in the available time. The after-action report describes this as conditional clearance, vehicles at own risk, a bureaucratic phrase that means we did what we could, but people might die. It fascinates me how the Causeway problem reveals the gap between planning and execution. The operational plan for Utah Beach allocated 750 men to seize and clear Causeway 2. Appleton has approximately 40 engineers who actually reached the objective, plus another 60 infantrymen from scattered units who've assembled nearby. That's 100 men executing a mission designed for 750. The shortage isn't just numerical, it's functional. Most of the missing men include the demolition specialists, the mine detector teams, the heavy equipment operators who were supposed to use bulldozers to clear obstacles. What Appleton has is riflemen and basic combat engineers improvising with hand tools. Causeway 1 at Poopaville, roughly 2 kilometers north, follows a similar pattern. The force designated to clear it, elements of the 501st PIR, landed scattered across miles of countryside. By 0600 hours, General Maxwell Taylor has assembled about 85 men and decided that waiting for proper strength is less viable than attacking immediately with available forces. They assault the German positions defending the inland end of the causeway in a 6-hour battle that's less coordinated operation than continuous close-quarters combat through Norman houses and hedgerows. By noon, the causeway is cleared. By mid-afternoon, when engineers finally examine it systematically, they discover the Germans had emplaced 37 mines that nobody triggered during the assault. Luck, apparently, sometimes substitutes for planning. Causeways 3 and 4 at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont present different challenges. The 502nd PIR, assigned to these objectives, achieves about 40% assembly by dawn, better than most units but still far short of full strength. They reach the causeways around 0730 hours and discover that the German defenders are positioned in depth, with machine gun nests covering the approaches and mortars pre-registered on likely assault routes. The infantry can suppress these positions but can't safely advance until the engineers clear the roadways. The engineers can't clear the roadways while under fire. The tactical problem requires coordinated infantry-engineer operations, but coordination requires communication, and most of the radios are lost or damaged or simply absent because the men carrying them landed in different fields. The solution emerges through improvisation rather than doctrine. Small infantry teams use covering fire to allow engineers to crawl forward in short rushes, clearing sections of causeway while the Germans are suppressed, then withdrawing before the enemy can respond effectively. It's dangerous, inefficient, and slow, but by mid-morning, enough mines have been located and marked that the engineers declare the causeways passable, again, with the critical qualifier, at own risk. The phrase appears repeatedly in the engineer logs from June 6th. It's not the clearance standard they trained for, it's the clearance standard the situation permitted. To me, the most revealing document from the causeway operations is a typed report filed in late June by Colonel John Pappas, the 101st Division engineer, killed on June 13th before he could see how his analysis would influence later doctrine. Pappas's report quantifies the equipment loss. Of the 487 tons of engineer supplies dropped with the division, only about 140 tons were recovered in usable condition by the end of D-Day. This included most of the mine detectors, the explosive charges for demolitions, the marking materials for obstacle clearance. His report argues that airborne engineer operations require radically different equipment packaging, smaller, more redundant caches instead of centralized bundles, on the assumption that dispersion will prevent recovery of most supplies. The causeway clearance ultimately succeeds not because the plan worked, but because junior leaders made sequential, pragmatic decisions that accumulated into functional outcomes. Appleton decided to mark instead of clear. Taylor decided to attack with 85 men instead of waiting for 750. Infantry squad leaders coordinated with engineers they'd never met to suppress positions covering roadways. None of this was rehearsed. None of it appeared in the operational plan, but it worked well enough that by the time the 4th Infantry Division began moving inland from Utah Beach, the causeways were passable. Tanks moved up the marked lanes. Vehicles followed. Some hit mines anyway. The records show at least 4 vehicle losses to explosives on June 6th. But the invasion wasn't bottled up at the beach. The German defensive masterpiece, the flooded lowlands and fortified causeways, had been breached. When the first Sherman tanks from the 4th Infantry Division reached Causeway 2 around 0900 hours, Appleton and his engineers were still marking mines in the shoulder areas. The tank commander, seeing the white cloth markers, slowed his column and proceeded single file through the cleared lane. The passage took approximately 20 minutes for a dozen vehicles, painfully slow by operational standards, but infinitely faster than being unable to pass at all. Appleton watched them go by, probably thinking about the mines he knew were still there, unmarked, in the sections his team hadn't had time to check. The tanks made it through. Whether that was skill or luck or some combination of both, nobody could say for certain. The causeway operations provide a useful lens for understanding what the Normandy invasion actually required versus what it was planned to require. The plan assumed sufficient forces, proper equipment, coordinated timing. The reality delivered scattered forces, missing equipment, and chaos. Success came from accepting reality and adapting continuously rather than waiting for conditions to match the plan. That's not the story that appears in the heroic narratives. There's nothing particularly dramatic about marking mines with white cloth or deciding to proceed at own risk. But it's the story the engineer logs tell. It's the story of infrastructure as battlefield, where the war was won or lost, not through glorious charges, but through methodical, dangerous work, clearing explosives from muddy embankments so that vehicles could drive to the actual fighting. Chapter 8. The German Paralysis, Enemy Perspective. The 6th of June, 1944, 0134 hours. The operations room of the 91st Luftlandedivision Infantry Division, headquartered near the village of Picoville, roughly 10 kilometers inland from where American paratroopers are beginning to land. Hauptmann Wilhelm Priller, duty officer for the night shift, receives the first report of parachute activity. His immediate problem: is this the invasion or is it a diversion? The standing orders from higher command are explicit. Do not commit reserves until the main enemy effort is identified. But identifying the main effort requires information, and the information arriving at division headquarters is contradictory, fragmentary, and multiplying faster than staff officers can process it. Parachute landings reported at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, also at Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, also near Heisville, also west of the Merderet River, also. Where's the concentration? Where's the main attack? The German defensive system in Normandy was built on doctrinal assumptions that made sense until they encountered an opponent who wasn't following the expected script. German planners assumed Allied airborne operations would feature concentrated drops on specific objectives: bridges, command posts, communications hubs. The doctrine for countering such operations called for rapid identification of drop zones, encirclement to prevent expansion, and commitment of mobile reserves to destroy the enemy before they could dig in. This doctrine had worked against smaller-scale operations in Crete, in the Mediterranean, even in Italy. It assumed the enemy would land as organized units that could be located, fixed, and destroyed through conventional maneuver warfare. It didn't account for paratroopers landing everywhere and nowhere simultaneously across 100 square kilometers. When I examined the German unit logs from the 91st Division and the 609th Infantry Division, the primary defensive forces in the American Airborne sector, what emerges is an organization suffering from information paralysis. The radio logs show a cascading series of contact reports, starting at 0120 hours and continuing through dawn. Each report describes American paratroopers in a different location. Company-level commanders report enemy in their sectors and request reinforcements. Battalion commanders aggregate these reports and forward them to regiment. Regimental commanders look at the totality of contacts and cannot determine whether they're facing a divisional strength assault or scattered raids. Without knowing the enemy's main effort, they cannot safely commit their mobile reserves. And without committed reserves, they cannot concentrate enough force to destroy any of the scattered American groups. The temporal sequence matters. At 0120 hours, the 91st Division receives its first definitive report of parachute landings. At 0145 hours, Division Headquarters issues a general alert, but withholds authority for local commanders to engage with more than reconnaissance forces. At 0215 hours, after receiving reports of paratroopers in at least 6 different locations, the division requests permission from 7th Army Headquarters to commit its mobile reserve, primarily the Divisional Fusilier Battalion, a a company of assault guns, and attached elements from the 609th Division. 7th Army, receiving similar requests from multiple divisions and lacking clear intelligence about whether this is the main invasion or a feint, denies the request, pending further clarification. The 91st Division spends the critical first hours of the invasion waiting for permission to fight. The communication breakdown compounds the paralysis. The 91st Division's primary telephone landline to 7th Army runs through a junction box near Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. At approximately 0340 hours, this line goes dead, probably cut by American paratroopers who found the cable and severed it, though German logs can only note communication interrupted, cause unknown. The division switches to radio communication, but radio in 1944 is slow, vulnerable to atmospheric conditions, and subject to Allied jamming. Messages that should take minutes take hours. Orders arrive obsolete. Requests for clarification generate responses to questions nobody's asking anymore, because the situation has evolved. The division commander, Major General Wilhelm Folly, isn't at headquarters when the paratroopers land. He's attending a conference at Rennes, over 100 kilometers away, part of a war game exercise scheduled before anyone knew June 6th would be D-Day. When division staff finally reach him by phone around 0230 hours, Folly orders an immediate return to take personal command. He departs Rennes around 0300 hours with a small staff escort, driving through darkness on roads that may or may not contain enemy forces. German logs record him as en route at 0400 hours. Expected arrival 0600 hours. He never arrives. An American patrol, probably from the 501st PIR, ambushes his staff car around 0600 hours near the village of Picoville. Folly and his aide are killed in the brief firefight. The 91st Division's commander is dead before most of his units have engaged the enemy. It strikes me that Folly's death wasn't tactically significant in the immediate sense. He'd been absent from headquarters during the critical early hours anyway, but it devastated German command and control for the subsequent 48 hours. The deputy commander, whoever he was, lacked Folly's authority to make decisions that deviated from standing orders. Unit commanders, uncertain who was in actual command, reverted to requesting permission for actions that should have been executed on initiative. The division that was supposed to be specifically trained for anti-airborne operations became tentative and reactive, precisely when aggression and initiative were required. The doctrinal paralysis shows most clearly in the 91st Division's handling of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. German reconnaissance reports the town occupied by American paratroopers around 0430 hours, roughly the time Lieutenant Colonel Krause's ad hoc force is consolidating control. The local German commander, recognizing the town's strategic importance, requests permission to launch an immediate counterattack with available forces. Division headquarters, still waiting for higher authority and still trying to determine if Sainte-Marie-du-Mont is the main enemy objective or a diversion, delays authorization. By the time approval comes through, around 0900 hours, the Americans have had nearly 5 hours to dig in, establish defensive positions, and prepare for exactly the counterattack the Germans are about to launch. The German assault, when it finally develops, follows doctrine precisely, which is part of the problem. The attack comes from predictable avenues of approach. Artillery preparation begins on schedule, giving the Americans clear warning that an attack is imminent. Infantry advances in coordinated waves, supported by assault guns. It's textbook methodology, and the Americans, who aren't bound by German doctrine, respond by abandoning the portions of town that are under fire and concentrating in areas the German assault plan doesn't cover. The attack stalls. German casualties mount. By afternoon, the counterattack has failed without ever threatening to recapture Sainte-Marie-du-Mont. When I cross-reference German after-action reports with American accounts of the same engagements, what's notable is how rarely the two sides seem to be describing the same battle. German reports emphasize their inability to locate American main positions, the apparently random nature of American resistance, the way entire squads would appear, engage, and then vanish before supporting fires could be brought to bear. American reports describe confused small unit actions, hasty defensive positions, withdrawal when overwhelmed, and reoccupation when German pressure shifted elsewhere. Neither side was executing doctrine. The Germans were trying to and failing. The Americans had abandoned doctrine as unworkable given their scattered condition. The Americans' improvisation proved more effective than the Germans' adherence to training. The flooded zones that were supposed to be a German advantage became a liability. The same inundations that restricted American vehicle movement also channelized German counterattacks onto the few passable routes, exactly where American forces, however scattered, could concentrate their limited firepower. German assault guns, which should have provided mobile fire support, bogged down in soft ground or were restricted to roads where American paratroopers had positioned their few anti-tank weapons. The defensive system that Rommel designed to contain an invasion worked against the German defenders when they tried to maneuver against an enemy already behind the beach obstacles. What haunts me about the German perspective is how clearly their officers recognized they were losing the initiative, but couldn't determine how to regain it. The 91st Division's war diary contains increasingly frustrated entries through June 6th. At 0800 hours, enemy activity reported across entire divisional sector. No concentration points identified. At 1200 hours, 7th Army requests assessment of enemy strength, unable to provide accurate estimate. Contacts too dispersed. At 1800 hours, current disposition suggests enemy main force between Coast and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, but evidence inconclusive. By the end of D-Day, after 16 hours of combat, German intelligence still couldn't tell their commanders where the Americans were in exploitable strength or where they were dangerously weak. The communications intercepts that Allied codebreakers were reading in real time, though this information didn't reach frontline commanders, show German units requesting permission to withdraw from untenable positions and being ordered to hold, regardless of losses. The orders came from officers miles away, who were working from maps that showed German positions as they were supposed to be, not as they actually existed after hours of combat. Units held until they were destroyed or overrun, achieving nothing except casualties. Other units that might have reinforced threatened sectors sat immobile, waiting for orders that never came, or that arrived too late to matter. The institutional failure extended beyond the divisional level. German 7th Army headquarters, responsible for the entire Normandy sector, received the first reports of Allied airborne activity at 0120 hours. But 7th Army couldn't commit strategic reserves without authorization from Army Group B, which couldn't commit reserves without authorization from OB West, which couldn't commit reserves without authorization from Berlin. The authorization chain extended through so many echelons that by the time permission to reinforce Normandy reached operational units, the invasion was firmly established. The German command system, built for defensive warfare, where commanders had time to study situations and issue methodical orders, collapsed when confronted with an operational tempo that required decisions in minutes, not hours. To me, the German perspective on the Normandy airborne assault reveals that the American paratroopers succeeded less because they did everything right, than because they confused the enemy so thoroughly that the Germans did almost nothing. The scattered drops that seemed catastrophic from an American planning perspective created a tactical situation that German doctrine couldn't process. The Americans won, not by executing their plan, but by forcing the Germans into a situation where their plans became irrelevant. That's a different kind of victory, messier, harder to claim as evidence of superior training or equipment or courage. But when you're reading German war diaries that describe paralysis, confusion, and missed opportunities, it's the victory that actually occurred. Chapter 9. The Disappeared. Silent Deaths in Water. The 6th of June, 1944, 01:15 hours. A flooded field approximately 2 kilometers south of Drop Zone D, near the Douve River. Private Robert Hansen of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment lands in water. Not mud, not marsh, water. 4 feet deep, maybe 5, cold and black and absolutely still. He's carrying 87 pounds of equipment: main parachute, reserve chute, rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, first aid kit, entrenching tool. The parachute canopy settles over the water's surface like a shroud. Hansen reaches for the harness release mechanisms, quick release boxes positioned at chest and waist. His fingers find metal. They turn the boxes. Nothing happens. The mechanisms are jammed, probably fouled with mud from the landing impact. He's in water over his head, weighted down by equipment he can't shed, covered by a parachute that's trapping him like a net. Nobody sees him. Nobody hears him. Within 90 seconds, Robert Hansen drowns. This is conjecture, of course. Hansen's body wasn't recovered until July 18, 1944, 6 weeks after D-Day, when French civilians draining their fields after the battle found him in a reclaimed flood zone. The Graves registration report describes remains recovered from water, parachute still attached, equipment intact, no visible combat wounds. The medical examiner noted fluid in the lungs, standard indicator of drowning. Estimated time of death, June 6th, between 0100 and 0200 hours. Based on the state of decomposition and the knowledge that this particular field was flooded on D-Day and drained in mid-July. Hansen's name appears on the casualty rolls as killed in action, which is technically accurate but misses the mechanism. He didn't die in action. He died in water, in darkness, probably within minutes of landing, almost certainly alone. When I examine the Graves registration records from the summer of 1944, the systematic recovery operations after the Normandy campaign, I find a pattern that the official histories largely omit. Between June 6th and August 15th, recovery teams working in the areas behind Utah Beach found 87 bodies that matched Hansen's profile. Paratroopers recovered from flooded zones or water-filled ditches, parachutes still attached, equipment present, no combat trauma, evidence of drowning. 87 documented cases. The actual number is probably higher. Some bodies were never found. Some were recovered by German forces and buried in military cemeteries without detailed cause of death documentation. Some were simply lost in the chaos of a combat zone, where record-keeping wasn't always comprehensive. The biomechanics of drowning while wearing parachute equipment are merciless. A paratrooper's combat load in Normandy averaged 80 to 90 pounds, distributed across the torso and attached via a harness system that, under normal conditions, could be released in seconds using quick-release mechanisms. But normal conditions meant dry ground, full visibility, no stress. The flooded zones behind Utah Beach created the opposite of normal conditions. Paratroopers landed in water they couldn't see, in darkness absolute enough that they didn't know they were over water until impact. The shock of cold immersion, water temperature in early June in Normandy was roughly 12 degrees Celsius, caused involuntary gasping reflex, which for men whose faces were already underwater meant inhaling water immediately. The weight of equipment pulled them under. The parachute canopy, settling over the surface, created a fabric barrier that prevented surfacing, even if they could shed the harness. The quick-release mechanisms themselves became death traps under certain conditions. The design required the boxes to be rotated 90 degrees, which activated internal springs that separated the harness connections. Mud or water infiltration could jam the mechanism. Impact shock could bend the metal housing slightly. Not enough to see, but enough to prevent the boxes from rotating. And even if the releases functioned correctly, the process required both hands and a degree of calm that's almost impossible to maintain when you're underwater, in darkness, fighting the physiological panic response of drowning. Training emphasized the importance of releasing the harness immediately upon landing, but training took place on dry drop zones in daylight. Nobody trained for landing in water in darkness, while weighted down and potentially injured from impact. The flooded zones themselves were a German defensive innovation that American intelligence understood but didn't fully account for in operational planning. Field Marshal Rommel had ordered the Douve River locks opened in early spring, deliberately inundating thousands of acres of low-lying farmland. The resulting flood zones varied in depth from a few inches in elevated areas to 6 feet or more in depressions and drainage ditches. The water was cold, stagnant, and opaque with sediment. It offered no landmarks, no reference points. A paratrooper landing in 4 feet of water in complete darkness had no way to know whether he was in a shallow puddle or the edge of a deeper channel. Moving in any direction could mean stepping into deeper water. Staying in place meant drowning where you stood if the water was over your head. The official casualty reports don't distinguish between combat deaths and drowning deaths. A paratrooper who drowned on D-Day is listed as killed in action on June 6, 1944, without specification of cause. This isn't conspiracy or cover-up, it's administrative simplification. From a bureaucratic perspective, the distinction doesn't matter. Dead is dead. Benefits and notifications are the same regardless of whether someone died from German fire or from drowning in a flooded field. But from a historical perspective, the distinction is significant because it reveals a category of casualties that resulted not from enemy action, but from environmental hazards that planning didn't adequately address. The estimates of drowning casualties vary widely, and this variation itself is revealing. The most conservative assessments, based only on documented graves registration reports like Hansen's, count approximately 87 confirmed drowning deaths among the 101st Airborne. More aggressive estimates, extrapolating from the percentage of paratroopers who landed in flooded zones and applying statistical models of equipment failure and survival rates, suggest numbers as high as 180. The truth is probably somewhere in between, but we'll never know precisely because the documentation doesn't exist. Many men who drowned in the early hours of June 6th were listed as missing for weeks or months until their bodies were recovered. Some were never found at all. They're among the casualties counted as missing, presumed dead, their actual fate unknown. To me, the most haunting aspect of the drowning deaths is their invisibility. These men died alone, in darkness, without witnesses. They didn't have last stands or final messages. They just fought against water and weight and failed. And when the sun rose on June 6th, they were already dead in fields that looked empty from the surface. Their friends who survived often didn't know what happened. They just knew certain men never appeared at assembly points, never showed up for missions, were eventually listed as casualties. The narrative of D-Day celebrates courage and sacrifice and collective achievement. It doesn't have room for the men who drowned before firing a shot, whose war ended not in combat, but in silent struggle against physics and bad luck. The German intelligence services knew about the drowning deaths. Interrogation reports from captured American paratroopers mention comrades who landed in water and disappeared. German patrols recovering American equipment from flooded zones occasionally found bodies still attached to parachutes. A report from the 709th Infantry Division, dated June 8th, describes recovery of enemy paratroop corpses from flooded agricultural areas, no apparent combat injuries. The Germans didn't publicize this information, it wasn't propaganda-worthy, but they noted it in after-action assessments. The flooded zones worked as defensive obstacles, not just by restricting movement, but by killing attackers passively, without requiring German action. The families of the drowned paratroopers received telegrams identical to those sent to families of men killed in combat. The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son was killed in action. The wording didn't distinguish between death by enemy fire and death by drowning. Most families never learned the actual circumstances. They knew their sons jumped into Normandy and died on D-Day, and that was the extent of the information they received. In post-war years, some families visited the American cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, where many of the drowned paratroopers are buried. They stood at headstones that gave name, rank, unit, and date of death. Nothing about water, nothing about the quick release mechanisms that failed, nothing about dying alone in darkness within minutes of landing in France. The lesson, if there's a lesson in deaths this random and preventable, is that warfare kills through multiple mechanisms, and the glamorous narrative of combat obscures mundane ways soldiers die. The 101st Airborne's mission in Normandy succeeded. The Causeways were seized, the Germans were confused, the invasion proceeded. That success required accepting casualties, including casualties from causes the plan didn't adequately address. The drowned paratroopers weren't betrayed or abandoned. They were unlucky. They jumped from aircraft over zones that looked like fields on maps, but were actually flooded. And they died before they could contribute anything except their presence to the overall chaos that helped the invasion succeed. That's not a story anyone wanted to tell. But when you're reading graves registration forms describing bodies recovered from water 6 weeks after D-Day, it's the story the evidence preserves. Chapter 10. Brecourt Manor, Deconstructing a Legend. The 6th of June, 1944, approximately 10:50 hours, a field near Brecourt Manor, roughly 2 kilometers inland from Utah Beach. Lieutenant Richard Winters of Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, has assembled 13 men, most from his platoon, a few stragglers from other units. They're positioned in a hedgerow, observing a German artillery battery, 4 105mm howitzers positioned to fire on Utah Beach, defended by approximately 50 German infantry and crew. The battalion commander has ordered Winters to assault and destroy the position. 13 men against 50, attacking across open ground toward prepared defenses. Winters studies the position, develops a plan, and executes an assault that will become one of the most celebrated small unit actions of the war. It's also one of the most contested, because nearly every participant remembered it differently. The Brecourt Manor assault achieved fame primarily through historian Stephen Ambrose's 1992 book, Band of Brothers, and the subsequent HBO miniseries. The action is presented as a textbook example of small unit tactics, fire and maneuver, use of terrain, leadership under pressure. It's taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point as a case study in aggressive infantry operations. The basic facts aren't disputed. Winters did lead an assault on a German position. The position was destroyed. The assault succeeded with relatively light American casualties. What's disputed is almost everything else: the timeline, the enemy's strength, the number of guns destroyed, even the identity of some participants. When I examine the multiple accounts of Brecourt Manor, Winters' after-action report written days after the event, his memoir, published in 2006, interview transcripts from other participants, German unit records, what emerges is not a single coherent narrative, but a collection of overlapping memories that agree on outcomes but diverge on details. Winters' account, which forms the basis for most histories, describes the assault lasting approximately 30 minutes. Private Walter Gordon, who participated, recalled it taking over 90 minutes in a 1991 interview. The German unit log from the artillery battalion that operated the guns doesn't mention the assault at all. It records the battery as being relocated due to enemy pressure around noon on June 6th, suggesting the Germans withdrew rather than being destroyed in place. The number of enemy killed varies by source. Winters' after-action report credits his team with 12 German casualties. A journalistic account published in 1945 claims 50 Germans killed or wounded. The German casualty list for the artillery battalion operating in that sector on June 6th lists 7 men killed or missing, total, for the entire day's operations across multiple engagements. It's possible the German records are incomplete. It's possible American estimates were inflated by counting the same casualties multiple times, or by including Germans who were wounded but evacuated. It's also possible that memory inflated numbers over time, which is a documented phenomenon in combat recollections. The disposition of the guns themselves presents similar contradictions. Winters reported destroying all 4 howitzers. Photographic evidence from later in June 6th shows at least one of the guns intact and abandoned, but not visibly damaged. Post-battle assessments by American engineers recorded 2 guns as destroyed, 1 disabled, 1 captured functional. German records indicate the battery relocated 3 guns and abandoned 1. All of these accounts could be partially true. Destroyed might mean disabled or rendered temporarily inoperable. Relocated might have occurred after the assault rather than instead of it. But they can't all be completely true simultaneously. It fascinates me that the Brecourt Manor assault became a legendary example of perfect tactics, when the evidence suggests it was considerably messier than the legend acknowledges. Winters himself, in later interviews, expressed ambivalence about the attention the action received. He noted that similar small unit assaults happened throughout June 6th, executed by leaders who never got famous because they didn't have historians writing about them or HBO producing their stories. What made Brecourt Manor special wasn't that it was tactically superior to every other assault that day. It was that it was documented in unusual detail and then amplified through popular culture. The pedagogical value of Brecourt Manor at West Point is interesting to consider. The action is taught as an example of fire and maneuver, of using minimal force to maximum effect through superior tactics. Students study Winters' approach, fixing the enemy with suppressive fire from one position, while assault teams maneuver to flanks, concentrating force at decisive points, maintaining momentum through aggressive action. This is all valid. Winters did execute these principles effectively. But the lesson students don't typically receive is that combat actions are ambiguous, that participants remember the same events differently, that heroic narratives are constructed from fragmentary evidence that doesn't always align. The German perspective on Brecourt Manor, to the extent it exists, is anticlimactic. The battery commander's report, if he filed one, hasn't been located in archives. The battalion war diary mentions artillery positions being adjusted due to infantry pressure, without specifying the Brecourt location. Interrogation reports from German artillerymen captured later in June describe standard defensive procedures: infantry screen forward, guns positioned for indirect fire, standing orders to relocate if threatened by enemy ground forces. The standing orders explain why the German response to winter's assault might have been withdrawal rather than sustained defense. Holding artillery positions against infantry attack wasn't doctrine. The guns were valuable. The crews were trained. If threatened, you moved the guns rather than fighting to the last man. What bothers me about how we use the Brécourt Manor story is that we've turned it into a morality tale about leadership and tactics, when it's actually a case study in historical construction. We have multiple conflicting accounts from American participants, minimal German documentation, physical evidence that doesn't definitively support any single version, and a popular narrative that has become authoritative through repetition rather than through superior evidentiary support. The assault happened. That's not in question. A German position that was firing on Utah Beach was eliminated, also not in question. But the precise details of how it happened, how long it took, how many casualties occurred, and even how many guns were destroyed remain genuinely uncertain. The fact that Brécourt Manor is taught at West Point using Winter's account exclusively, without acknowledging that the German after-action report, which describes a tactical withdrawal under pressure, was only translated in 2003 and presents a significantly different interpretation, reveals how institutional narratives become fixed even when evidence is ambiguous. West Point teaches Brécourt as an example of perfect execution. It could also teach it as an example of why historians must treat single-source narratives with skepticism, even when those sources are credible and well-intentioned people, like Winters. Memory reconstructs events. Participants see different things from different positions. Official reports are written to emphasize success and minimize ambiguity. These are features of combat documentation, not bugs. To me, the value of deconstructing Brécourt Manor isn't to diminish Winter's achievement or to suggest the assault wasn't significant. It's to demonstrate that even the best documented small actions of D-Day remain partly unknowable. If we can't reconstruct a single firefight involving 13 Americans and approximately 50 Germans, with multiple survivor testimonies and some physical evidence, how reliable are our larger narratives of the Normandy campaign? The answer is that they're approximations. Useful, mostly accurate approximations, based on aggregating many imperfect accounts, but approximations nonetheless. We build historical truth from fragments that don't quite fit together, acknowledging that the final picture will always have gaps and contradictions that we paper over with narrative confidence. Chapter 11. The Ammunition Crisis, Rationing Survival. The 7th of June, 1944, 1600 hours. A hastily established supply depot in an orchard near Highsville. Captain Herbert Sobel, S4 supply officer for the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, sits at a folding table covered with ammunition requisition forms. The numbers he's tallying don't work. The regiment jumped into Normandy with planned ammunition reserves sufficient for 48 hours of sustained combat operations. They've been fighting for 40 hours. And Sobel's inventory shows they're down to approximately 30% of planned stocks. The mathematics are brutally simple. 5 rounds per rifleman until resupply arrives. 5 rounds. For infantrymen whose M1 Garand rifles carry 8-round clips and who've been trained to fire aggressively to suppress enemy positions. Sobel types a requisition marked Critical, Priority Alpha, and adds a note that would have been unthinkable in training. Ration. 5 rounds per man until resupply, enforced by court-martial if necessary. The ammunition shortage didn't develop suddenly. It was baked into the airborne operation from the moment the first paratroopers scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula. Each soldier jumped with a basic combat load, roughly 100 rounds for riflemen, more for automatic weapons specialists, less for officers and specialists carrying different equipment. Additional ammunition was packed in equipment bundles, large containers pushed from aircraft on separate parachutes, color-coded and marked for recovery by specific units. The plan assumed that units would land near their drop zones, quickly locate their equipment bundles, and distribute ammunition before engaging the enemy. The reality was that 68% of equipment bundles were never recovered, either because they landed in inaccessible areas, were captured by Germans, fell into flooded zones, or simply couldn't be found in the darkness and chaos of D-Day. By the evening of June 6th, company commanders across the 101st Airborne were reporting ammunition shortages in after-action summaries. Easy Company, 506th PIR, reported 73 men present, with approximately 4,000 rounds total, an average of 55 rounds per man, roughly half of planned basic load. Dog Company reported worse, 61 men with an estimated 3,000 rounds, approximately 49 rounds per man. The regimental ammunition officer compiled these reports and calculated that the regiment as a whole possessed approximately 40% of planned ammunition stocks. This shortfall meant that standard tactical doctrine, suppressive fire, fire superiority, aggressive assaults, wasn't sustainable. The 101st would have to fight differently, or stop fighting until resupply arrived. Sobel's decision to centralize ammunition distribution was controversial. Battalion commanders wanted autonomous control over their stocks, arguing that centralization would slow response to tactical emergencies. Sobel overruled them, implementing a system where all recovered ammunition was pooled at regimental level and redistributed based on tactical priority rather than unit ownership. A company about to assault a German position received priority allocation. A company in defensive posture received minimum allocation. The system was administratively complex and required constant reassessment as the tactical situation evolved. But it maximized the effective use of limited resources. It also meant that some units couldn't execute planned operations because ammunition wasn't available. Objectives were bypassed rather than assaulted. German positions were avoided rather than engaged. When I examined Sobel's personal notes from this period, discovered in archives decades after his death, what emerges is a portrait of an officer performing competent logistics work under impossible constraints. Sobel is remembered primarily through Band of Brothers, where he's portrayed as a martinet whose harsh training methods prepared Easy Company for combat, but whose tactical incompetence led to his relief from command. The portrayal isn't entirely unfair. Sobel was relieved from command of Easy Company before D-Day due to concerns about his tactical judgment. But his work as regimental supply officer in Normandy was professional and effective. He identified the ammunition crisis early, implemented rationing that stretched limited stocks to cover critical needs, and maintained detailed records that allowed higher headquarters to understand supply requirements for future operations. The types of shortages varied by weapon system. Rifle ammunition was scarce but manageable. Riflemen could operate with reduced loads and make every shot count. Machine gun ammunition was critically short. The M1919A4 Browning machine gun, the squad-level automatic weapon, had a sustained fire rate of 400 to 600 rounds per minute. A single sustained engagement could expend 1,000 rounds. The regiment's machine gunners jumped with planned stocks sufficient for perhaps 5 such engagements per gun. By June 7th, many machine gun teams were down to a few hundred rounds total. This forced tactical adaptations. Machine guns used in short, carefully targeted bursts rather than sustained suppressive fire. Some guns were held in reserve entirely, saved for defensive operations where their firepower would be absolutely essential. The mortar ammunition shortage was perhaps most tactically significant. The 60mm mortar was the infantry company commander's organic artillery, a portable indirect fire weapon that could hit German positions behind cover or in defilade. Each company was supposed to have 3 mortars with approximately 100 rounds per tube. By June 7th, average stocks were below 30 rounds per tube, and several companies had lost their mortars entirely in the drop. This meant that infantry assaults had to be conducted without suppressive fires on enemy positions, significantly increasing casualties and reducing chances of success. Sobel's logs record multiple instances where planned attacks were postponed or canceled specifically because mortar ammunition wasn't available to support them. The resupply problem was compounded by poor weather and operational priorities. The 4th Infantry Division, fighting its way inland from Utah Beach, had priority for ammunition resupply because they were engaged in continuous offensive operations. The 101st Airborne, scattered and conducting largely defensive operations, was lower priority. The 1st Ammunition Resupply Convoy didn't reach the division's positions until June 9th, 72 hours after the initial jump. Those 72 hours required continuous rationing, tactical restraint, and in some cases simply avoiding engagements that would have consumed ammunition the division didn't have. German after-action reports noted that American fire discipline in the first week of June was surprisingly restrained. They interpreted it as tactical sophistication when it was actually desperation. It strikes me that Sobel's satisfaction if he felt any, must have been complex. Here was a man who'd been removed from combat command because superiors doubted his tactical ability, proving himself essential through administrative competence. The ammunition rationing system he implemented kept the regiment in action when uncontrolled distribution would have led to some units running dry, while others sat on excess stocks. His detailed record-keeping provided data that influenced airborne logistics doctrine for subsequent operations. But this work was invisible compared to combat leadership. Sobel wouldn't be remembered for the lives he saved through competent supply management. He'd be remembered as the officer who couldn't hack it in command, immortalized in a television series that depicted him as borderline incompetent. The broader lesson from the ammunition crisis is that logistics determines tactics more than tactics determines logistics. The 101st's tactical aggressiveness in Normandy, the celebrated initiative and offensive spirit, was constrained by the mundane reality that they didn't have enough bullets. Commanders made decisions based not on tactical opportunity, but on ammunition availability. Aggressive leaders who wanted to assault German positions were told no, not because the attacks couldn't succeed tactically, but because expending ammunition on those attacks would leave the regiment unable to defend against German counterattacks. This isn't the story that appears in heroic narratives, where courage and initiative overcome material limitations. But it's the story that Sobel's requisition forms tell. A division fighting with roughly 30% of planned ammunition stocks, rationing themselves to survival, waiting for beach resupply that took 4 days to arrive. Chapter 12. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, The Price of Aggression. The 8th of June, 1944, 0630 hours. The outskirts of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, a Norman village roughly 5 kilometers inland from Utah Beach. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment is preparing to assault German positions defending the town. The objective is straightforward: seize Sainte-Marie-du-Mont and clear the route to Carentan, enabling the link-up of Utah and Omaha beachheads. The tactical situation is less straightforward. The regiment has assembled approximately 60% of its jumped strength, better than most units, but still significantly under planned numbers. Artillery support is minimal. The division's pack howitzers were lost in the drop. Air support is unavailable due to weather. The attack will be straight infantry against prepared German defensive positions, without the supporting fires that doctrine considers essential for success. Battalion commanders voiced concerns during the pre-assault briefing. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole, commanding the 3rd Battalion, noted that his unit had approximately 400 men against German defenders of unknown but likely substantial strength, occupying prepared positions in bocage terrain that favored defense. He recommended waiting for artillery support, or at least for additional ammunition stocks. Colonel George Van Horn Mosley, the regimental commander, overruled him. The operational timeline required Carentan to be captured quickly. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont blocked the approach to Carentan. Waiting for ideal conditions meant giving the Germans time to reinforce. The attack would proceed on schedule, with available forces. The assault began at 0630 hours, with a brief mortar barrage, all the supporting fire the regiment could muster, given ammunition constraints. The barrage lasted perhaps 5 minutes, and expended roughly 1/3 of the regiment's remaining mortar rounds. Then the infantry advanced across open fields toward German positions, anchored on the town's eastern edge. The first wave, roughly 120 men from Baker Company, covered about 200 meters before encountering German machine gun fire from concealed positions in hedgerows. The advance stalled. Men went to ground, sought cover, returned fire. 8 minutes into the assault, Baker Company reported 12 casualties and requested permission to withdraw. Permission denied. Push forward. When I examined the medical evacuation logs from Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, cross-referenced with the unit after-action reports, what emerges is a picture of attrition that exceeded tactical gain. The regiment made 3 separate assault waves between 0630 and 1145 hours. Each wave advanced incrementally, 200 meters, then another 150 meters, then another 100 meters. Each wave took casualties disproportionate to ground gained. By noon, the regiment had advanced approximately 450 meters and reached the outskirts of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont proper. They'd suffered 87 casualties, 23 killed, 47 wounded requiring evacuation, 17 wounded but remaining in action. The casualty-to-distance ratio was approximately 19 casualties per 100 meters of advance, more than twice the average for hedgerow fighting in Normandy. The village itself was defended by elements of the German 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, paratroopers, ironically, defending against paratroopers. German doctrine emphasized small unit defense, using terrain advantages, and Sainte-Marie-du-Mont offered excellent defensive terrain. Stone buildings providing cover and concealment, narrow streets creating kill zones, hedgerows compartmentalizing the battlefield, and preventing American forces from concentrating. The Germans also had something the Americans lacked: artillery support. German 105mm howitzers, positioned several kilometers away, delivered indirect fire on American assembly areas whenever the attack paused, inflicting additional casualties and preventing the Americans from consolidating positions. The turning point, if it can be called that, came around 1400 hours, when a combined assault by remnants of Baker and Charlie companies penetrated German positions on the eastern edge of town and established a foothold in several buildings. The Germans conducted an immediate counterattack, retaking one building but leaving the Americans in possession of two others. Both sides were exhausted, low on ammunition, taking casualties. The difference was that the Americans had orders to hold at all costs, while the Germans had flexibility to withdraw if the position became untenable. By 1800 hours, the German defenders began a staged withdrawal toward Carentan, leaving the village to the Americans. Captain Stanley Morgan, battalion surgeon for the 3rd Battalion, established his aid station in a barn on the outskirts of Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, around 1820 hours. His medical log from that evening makes for grim reading: 47 urgent surgical cases waiting for treatment, 2 operating tables, morphine supply down to 14 syrettes. Morgan had to triage, decide who got immediate treatment and who waited, knowing that some of those who waited would die or lose limbs that might have been saved with faster intervention. His notes describe the moral calculus. Abdominal wounds received priority because they killed faster. Extremity trauma was delayed unless arterial bleeding was present. Men with serious but not immediately life-threatening wounds were stabilized and marked for evacuation whenever vehicles became available. Evacuation didn't happen until June 10th, because the routes to the beach were contested, and vehicles were prioritized for ammunition resupply over casualty evacuation. The official after-action report describes Sainte-Marie-du-Mont as a successful advance against determined enemy resistance. This is accurate in that the objective was achieved, the town was captured, the route toward Carentan was opened. But the report omits the cost-benefit analysis that makes the success questionable. The regiment advanced roughly 800 meters total over 12 hours of fighting, suffering 87 casualties, and expended approximately 40% of remaining ammunition stocks. The position captured had already been abandoned by defenders who withdrew in good order to prepared positions closer to Carentan. Tactically, the Americans gained ground. Strategically, they exhausted themselves achieving an objective the Germans had decided wasn't worth defending to destruction. What haunts me reading Morgan's medical log is what he doesn't write. How do you choose between 47 men when you can only treat 14 immediately? His entries are clinical: patient numbers, wound types, treatment provided or deferred. No indication of the emotional toll, no reflection on the decisions, just data. Patient 23, abdominal wound, immediate surgery, died during procedure. Patient 24, compound fracture right femur, arterial bleeding controlled, evacuation delayed, subsequent amputation. The log converts human suffering into administrative records, which is necessary for Morgan to function, but strips away the reality that each patient number represents someone's son, someone's husband, someone who jumped into France 2 days ago and is now dying in a Norman barn because surgical capacity is insufficient. The battalion commander who ordered the repeated assaults on Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, Colonel John Michaelis, was relieved of command 3 weeks later. The official reason given was exhaustion, 21 days of continuous combat operations without relief. The unofficial reason, documented in confidential correspondence between division and corps headquarters, was concern about reckless expenditure of lives in pursuit of tactical objectives of marginal value. Michaelis had been aggressive, which is generally a virtue in combat commanders, but his aggression hadn't been tempered by calculation of costs versus benefits. Sainte-Marie-du-Mont was the exemplar. Ground gained at a casualty rate that wasn't sustainable for more than a few operations before the regiment ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. To me, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont represents the tension between operational urgency and tactical reality. The invasion timeline required rapid advance toward Carentan. German resistance had to be overcome quickly, but the means available, understrength infantry without artillery or air support, operating with limited ammunition, weren't sufficient for rapid advance without accepting casualties that degraded future capability. The regiment succeeded tactically and failed sustainably. They took the objective but spent themselves doing it, which meant subsequent operations had to be conducted with diminished strength. That's a Pyrrhic victory, success achieved at a cost that makes future success more difficult. The after-action report doesn't use that language, but when you calculate 2.56 casualties per 100 meters of advance and compare it to 0.73 casualties per 100 meters for typical Normandy operations, the mathematics tell the story. Chapter 13. The Carentan Corridor, Inter-Unit Friction. The 10th of June, 1944, 0800 hours. A road junction approximately 2 kilometers north of Carentan. Major General Maxwell Taylor, commander of the 101st Airborne Division, attempts to establish radio contact with Major General Charles Gerhardt, commander of the 29th Infantry Division, advancing from Omaha Beach. The two divisions are supposed to link up near Carentan, creating a continuous Allied front between the American beachheads. The coordination is critical for the next phase of operations. The radio contact fails. Taylor's SCR-300 radio, operating on frequencies assigned to airborne units, cannot communicate with Gerhardt's SCR-193 radio, operating on frequencies assigned to infantry divisions. The equipment is incompatible. Taylor writes a message by hand and dispatches a runner by jeep to locate 29th Division headquarters and establish physical contact. The communications incompatibility wasn't an oversight or accident. It was the result of institutional decisions made months before D-Day. The Army's Signal Corps had developed separate radio systems for different types of units. The SCR-300 backpack radio for infantry and airborne forces, the SCR-193 vehicular radio for mechanized units. The systems operated on different frequency ranges and used different modulation techniques. Within their respective user communities, they worked well. Between communities, they couldn't talk to each other. This wasn't a problem in training, where units operated independently. It became a catastrophic problem in Normandy, where success required close coordination between airborne forces and amphibious units that had never trained together and couldn't communicate electronically. When I examined Taylor's personal diary from June 10th through 12th, declassified in 1978, what emerges is mounting frustration with command and control problems that should have been solved during planning but weren't. His entries describe 3 failed attempts to reach 29th Division headquarters by radio on June 10th, resulting in a dispatch of a liaison officer by vehicle. The officer got lost in unfamiliar terrain, took 7 hours to locate 29th Division headquarters, and returned after dark with map coordinates that were incorrect due to a transcription error. A second attempt on June 11th succeeded in establishing physical contact, but the coordination meeting was delayed by 12 hours because neither division commander could confirm the meeting time via radio. These delays sound trivial in isolation, but they cascaded into operational consequences. The failure to coordinate artillery support provides a concrete example. The 101st needed artillery fires on German positions, defending the northern approaches to Carentan. The division's organic artillery, 12-pack howitzers, was mostly lost in the drop. The 29th Division had ample artillery, but couldn't provide fire support without a forward observer from the 101st establishing communications with 29th Division fire direction centers. The forward observer had an SCR-300 radio. The fire direction center used SCR-193 radios. No communication possible. The solution required physically co-locating the forward observer with a 29th Division radio operator, who could relay fire missions, introducing delay and increasing the chance of miscommunication. Multiple fire missions were delayed or canceled because the coordination process was too slow for tactical timelines. The planned link-up between the 101st Airborne and 29th Infantry Division was supposed to occur at 1000 hours on June 11th, near the village of Isigny. Official planning documents at the National Archives show detailed coordination, boundaries between units clearly marked, communication procedures established, liaison officers designated. The reality was confusion compounded by incompatible equipment, Combat patrols from both divisions nearly engaged each other on the morning of June 11th, because neither could radio the other to confirm positions. A patrol from the 506th PIR encountered what they believed to be a German patrol in American uniforms, a known German tactic. They were preparing to engage when the other patrol fired a green flare, the designated recognition signal. The German patrol was actually from the 115th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. The near fratricide was avoided by luck and a remembered recognition signal, not by functioning communications. The armor support coordination was similarly problematic. Sherman tanks from the 74th Tank Battalion were supposed to support the 101st Assault on Carentan. The tanks arrived from Omaha Beach on June 11th, 3 hours late because the Tank Battalion commander couldn't confirm routes with airborne commanders via radio, and his maps showed outdated information. When the tanks finally reached the 101st's positions, they couldn't coordinate directly with infantry because, again, radio incompatibility. The solution was to assign tank infantry teams, where a paratrooper rode on each tank, communicating with infantry via hand signals and directing tank fire through the tank commander's open hatch. It worked, but it was improvised and inefficient, and it required paratroopers to expose themselves riding on tanks to serve as human communications relays. It bothers me that Eisenhower's headquarters knew about the radio incompatibility problem in April 1944. A memo from the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force Signal Officer, dated April 21st, identifies the SCR-300 and SCR-193 incompatibility as a significant coordination challenge for joint operations. The memo recommends either procuring compatible radios or establishing radio relay teams at division boundaries to enable inter-unit communication. Neither recommendation was implemented before D-Day. The explanation given in subsequent investigations was that fixing the problem would have required either delaying the invasion to procure new equipment or diverting resources from other critical preparations. The decision was made to accept the communications limitation as an acceptable risk. The human cost of that decision is difficult to quantify, but probably significant. How many coordination delays resulted in missed opportunities to destroy German units? How many casualties occurred because artillery support couldn't be coordinated? How many tactical advantages were lost because units couldn't communicate in real time? These questions can't be answered definitively because we can't run the counterfactual where communications worked properly. But we can document specific instances where the incompatibility created problems, and those instances were numerous enough that post-war analysis identified communications as one of the major friction points in the Normandy campaign. The eventual link-up between Utah and Omaha beachheads occurred on June 12th, approximately 36 hours behind schedule. The delay was attributed in official reports to determined German resistance, which was true but incomplete. German resistance was overcome tactically. The delay came from operational-level coordination failures that prevented American units from concentrating combat power effectively. The 101st and 29th Divisions eventually learned to work together through improvised solutions. Liaison officers physically co-located, radio relay teams, hand-delivered messages, even motorcycle couriers riding between headquarters. These workarounds functioned, but they introduced delay and uncertainty that gave the Germans additional time to reposition and reinforce. To me, the communications failure represents institutional dysfunction at a level removed from individual competence or courage. The soldiers and officers in Normandy performed admirably, given the tools they had. The problem was that they were given tools that didn't work together, and the institutional army knew this and decided it was acceptable. That decision, to accept communications incompatibility as a risk rather than delaying the invasion to fix it, reflects a calculation that the strategic imperative to invade in June 1944 outweighed the tactical costs of degraded coordination. The calculation was probably correct in strategic terms. The invasion succeeded. But when you're reading Taylor's diary entries, describing his inability to reach adjacent division commanders by radio, when you're documenting near fratricide incidents because patrols couldn't communicate, the strategic correctness feels hollow. The mission succeeded despite broken communications, not because anyone decided broken communications were acceptable. Chapter 14, The Hill 30 Defense, Attrition Arithmetic. The 13th of June, 1944, 0400 hours. A defensive position on Hill 30, a low ridgeline overlooking the Carentan-Perrier Road. Staff Sergeant Donald Malarkey, squad leader in Easy Company, 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, conducts a pre-dawn inspection of his squad's positions. 7 men present out of 12 who jumped on D-Day. Squad strength has degraded from combat casualties, evacuations for wounds and illness, and 1 man missing who may be dead or captured, or simply lost somewhere in the bocage. Of the 7 present, 3 have functional rifles, 2 have rifles that jam intermittently, 2 have weapons that are essentially inoperable, but they're carrying them anyway because admitting you have a non-functional rifle means you might be pulled from the line. Malarkey's log entry, one of the few squad-level records from this period, reads, Day 11 in line, squad strength, 7 of 12. Rifle condition, 3 functional, 2 jamming intermittent, 2 unserviceable. Morale, they've stopped asking when we're getting relieved. The 101st Airborne Division was designed for rapid insertion and short-duration operations. Parachute infantry aren't equipped or organized for sustained defensive operations. They lack the heavy weapons, the logistical depth, and the personnel reserves of standard infantry divisions. Doctrine called for airborne units to conduct their assault missions and be relieved within 72 hours by conventional forces that could hold the ground they'd seized. By June 13th, the 101st had been in continuous contact for 168 hours, 7 days without relief, conducting both offensive and defensive operations, degrading steadily through attrition that wasn't being replaced. The nature of the degradation was cumulative and multifaceted. Combat casualties were the obvious factor, men killed or wounded removed from the unit's effective strength. But illness and equipment failure contributed almost as significantly. Trench foot, a condition caused by prolonged exposure to cold, wet conditions, affected approximately 15% of the division by mid-June. Men whose feet were infected couldn't walk effectively, which meant they couldn't patrol, couldn't assault, could barely defend their positions. They should have been evacuated for medical treatment, but evacuation capacity was limited, and medical priority went to combat wounds. So men with trench foot stayed in line, contributing minimally, occupying roster positions without providing effective combat power. Equipment failure followed a predictable degradation curve. The M1 Garand rifle, under ideal conditions with regular cleaning, was reliable to thousands of rounds. Under Normandy conditions, constant exposure to mud, limited cleaning supplies, continuous use without proper maintenance, the weapons began failing after a week. The gas system that operated the rifle's semi-automatic mechanism was particularly vulnerable. Mud infiltration caused gas port blockage, which prevented the weapon from cycling properly. A jammed M1 became a single-shot weapon, requiring manual operation of the bolt after each round. Some rifles degraded further, becoming essentially non-functional. Malarkey's notation of 2 unserviceable rifles in a 7-man squad meant those 2 soldiers were combat ineffective unless given replacement weapons, which weren't available. When I examined the battalion surgeon's reports from mid-June, cross-referenced with division-level morale assessments, the picture becomes more concerning. The surgeon's report from June 15th notes that 23% of personnel examined showed acute stress reactions, the contemporary term for what would later be called combat fatigue, or PTSD. Symptoms included inability to sleep, exaggerated startle response, difficulty concentrating, and in severe cases, inability to function in combat. Division morale reports from the same period rate units as combat effective, which was technically true, but missed the nuance. The units could still fight, but they were fighting at significantly degraded effectiveness compared to their jumped strength, and with psychological strain that was accumulating. The mathematics of sustained operations become clear when you track unit strength over time. Easy Company jumped on D-Day with 144 men. By June 13th, present for duty strength was 73, a 51% reduction. Of those 73, approximately 15 had trench foot or other medical conditions that limited their effectiveness. Another 12 showed signs of acute stress reactions. That left perhaps 46 fully effective soldiers out of an original 144, a 68% degradation in effective strength over 11 days. This wasn't unusual. Similar patterns appeared across the division. The organization was consuming itself through continuous operations without replacement or recovery time. The defensive mission on Hill 30 was relatively static: hold the ridgeline, prevent German movement along the Carentan-Perrières road, maintain observation of German positions to the south. It sounds passive, but required constant activity. Patrols had to be sent out nightly to ensure Germans weren't infiltrating American positions. Observation posts had to be manned continuously. Defensive positions had to be maintained and improved. All of this required manpower that was increasingly scarce. Malarkey's squad, which should have been able to sustain a continuous observation post and rotate men through guard shifts while allowing some to sleep, could barely manage minimal security. The 7-man squad meant that each man was pulling guard duty every few hours, with minimal sleep between shifts. The relief that was supposed to come on June 14th was delayed when the 83rd Infantry Division, moving up from Utah Beach, encountered German resistance that slowed their advance. The 101st remained in position on Hill 30 through June 17th, a total of 15 days in continuous contact since D-Day. By the time relief actually arrived, Easy Company's present-for-duty strength was 61 men, with perhaps 35 fully effective. The unit had lost 83 men to all causes, 57% of jumped strength, while remaining online and rated as combat effective in official assessments. It occurs to me that combat effective is an administrative category that doesn't capture the reality of degraded units held in action beyond sustainable limits. Easy Company was combat effective in that it could still execute defensive missions and conduct limited offensive operations. But comparing a 61-man company with 35 fully effective soldiers to a full-strength company of 144 is comparing organizations with fundamentally different capabilities. The degraded company couldn't conduct the platoon-sized operations that were standard tactics. It couldn't absorb losses and remain effective. It couldn't execute complex maneuvers that required coordination across multiple elements. It could hold ground, barely, and that's what it did. The question of when degradation becomes combat ineffectiveness is partly subjective. Different commanders have different thresholds. But there's a mathematical reality. Below a certain strength, infantry units lose capabilities qualitatively, not just quantitatively. A 40-man company isn't a 140-man company operating at 28% effectiveness. It's a fundamentally different organization with different tactical options. The 101st Airborne in mid-June was full of these organizationally transformed units, companies functioning as platoons, platoons functioning as squads, squads functioning as fire teams. The aggregate division was still combat effective, but the internal architecture had collapsed into smaller units operating with less capability. To me, Hill 30 represents the invisible grind of sustained operations that heroic narratives typically skip. There's no dramatic battle, no crucial engagement, no particular heroism beyond the everyday endurance of men staying in line when they're exhausted and sick and under-equipped. Malarkey's squad log entries become progressively shorter through June, which itself tells a story. Early entries describe activities, note observations, record details. By mid-June, the entries are terse: held position, 2 men sick, no contact. The degradation of documentation mirrors the degradation of the unit. Less energy for record keeping because all available energy goes into survival. Chapter 15. The Replacement System. Organizational Dissolution. The 23rd of June, 1944. A personnel processing center established in a field near the village of Colombières. Second Lieutenant Norman Dyke reports for assignment to the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 101st Airborne Division, as a replacement officer. Dyke completed airborne training 6 weeks ago. He's made 5 qualification jumps, the minimum required for the parachutist badge. He's been in the Army for 14 months, none of it in combat. His personnel file sits on a table next to the file of First Lieutenant Thomas Meehan III, the man he's replacing. Meehan's file notes 2 years of airborne training, 14 training jumps, extensive leadership experience, and comprehensive knowledge of every man in Easy Company, which he commanded. Status: killed in action, June 6th, when his aircraft was shot down before paratroopers could jump. Dyke is assigned to command Easy Company, despite never having met any of the men, never having jumped in combat, and having spent the past 17 days wondering if he'd survive the replacement pipeline. The replacement system was designed to solve a simple problem. Combat units suffer casualties. Casualties create vacancies. vacancies must be filled to maintain unit effectiveness. The solution was to train individual replacements in the United States, ship them to Europe, and assign them to units that had suffered losses. On paper, the system maintained unit strength. In practice, it transformed veteran organizations into mixed groups of experienced survivors and inexperienced newcomers who didn't know each other and hadn't trained together. The cohesion that made airborne units effective, the shared training, the personal bonds, the collective experience, dissolved as replacements diluted veteran cadres. When I examined the personnel replacement records for the 101st Airborne Division through June 1944, the scale of turnover is striking. Between June 8th and June 30th, the division received 1,847 replacement personnel to offset a 38% casualty rate from D-Day through the Carentan operations. These replacements arrived in batches: 412 on June 23rd, 381 on June 26th, smaller groups throughout the period. They were assigned to units based on administrative necessity, wherever vacancies existed, without regard to whether the unit could effectively integrate them before the next combat operation. The integration challenges were immediate and multifaceted. Replacements didn't know their squad leaders' names, let alone their leadership styles or tactical preferences. They didn't know company standard operating procedures, the informal practices that veteran units develop through experience. They didn't know recognition signals, rally points, or the terrain they'd be operating in. Veteran soldiers, who'd survived through 11 days of combat, viewed replacements with suspicion. A replacement was a liability, someone who might panic, might make mistakes, might get people killed through inexperience. Trust had to be earned, but earning trust required time and shared experience, neither of which was available when units were continuously in contact. The statistical evidence for replacement vulnerability is clear. Personnel data from the 101st shows that replacements assigned in late June suffered casualty rates approximately 3 times higher than veterans during their first 30 days with the unit. A veteran soldier who'd survived D-Day had perhaps an 8% probability of becoming a casualty in a given week of operations. A replacement had approximately a 24% probability during his first 4 weeks. The elevated risk declined over time as replacements gained experience, but the first month was disproportionately lethal. This wasn't because replacements were less capable fundamentally. It was because they lacked the tactical knowledge that veterans had acquired through survival. The leadership vacuum compounded the integration problem. Many of the officers and NCOs who trained the original units were casualties by late June. They'd been replaced by men like Dyke, qualified on paper, but lacking the experience and personal relationships that made leadership effective. Easy Company's situation was typical. Of the 12 sergeants and 4 officers who jumped on D-Day, 6 sergeants and 2 officers were casualties by June 23rd. Their replacements included men promoted from within, corporals elevated to sergeant, sergeants elevated to platoon leader, and external replacements assigned without prior connection to the unit. The internal promotions preserved some continuity, but created new vacancies at lower levels that had to be filled by replacements. The question that haunts the personnel records is philosophical. At what point does a replacement-heavy unit cease to be the original organization? The 506th PIR that jumped on D-Day comprised specific individuals who trained together for months or years. By June 30th, 43% of personnel were replacements who hadn't been part of that training. Was it still the same organization, or had it become something different with the same designation? The Ship of Theseus problem applied to military units. The division retained its institutional identity, its battle honors, its organizational structure, but the human composition had changed substantially. Veterans began requesting transfers to rear areas in late June, which I find revealing. These weren't cowards or malingerers. They were men who'd survived D-Day and 2 weeks of continuous operations, and now faced the prospect of training replacements who would likely die from inexperience. Some veterans didn't want that responsibility. Others simply didn't want to invest emotionally in people who probably wouldn't survive long enough for the investment to matter. The transfer requests were generally denied. The division needed experienced personnel to maintain capability. But the fact that veterans were requesting to leave says something about the psychological burden of the replacement system. The replacement crisis highlighted fundamental tensions in Army personnel policy. The system prioritized manning levels, keeping units at authorized strength over unit cohesion. An understrength veteran company was considered less combat effective than a full-strength company with 40% replacements, even though the veteran company might actually perform better due to cohesion and experience. The Army's statistical models treated soldiers as interchangeable parts. One rifleman plus training equals standard combat effectiveness. Combat experience taught that cohesion mattered more than individual skill, that a veteran squad with 60% strength could outperform a full-strength squad of replacements. To me, the personnel records from late June read like an organizational dissolution in progress. The 101st Airborne Division that jumped on D-Day was a specific group of people with shared history and identity. The 101st Airborne Division that was relieved on July 12th had the same organizational designation, but was 43% different people. This created an identity crisis. Veterans felt they were losing their unit, replacements felt they were joining a unit that didn't accept them, and the institutional Army treated both groups as fungible resources to be managed statistically. The division remained combat effective by organizational measures, but effectiveness is more than the sum of individual capabilities. It includes cohesion, trust, shared understanding. Those qualities dissolved through turnover and could only be rebuilt through time and shared experience. The replacement system didn't account for that rebuilding process. It just plugged bodies into vacancies and assumed the organization would continue functioning. Chapter 16: The Silence After Action, Curating the Record. July 1944. A temporary office in a requisition building near Southampton, England. Major John Howard, assigned as historical officer for the 101st Airborne Division, reviews after-action reports from the Normandy campaign. His task is to compile an official history of the division's operations for archival purposes and to support future planning. The reports he's reading tell a story of objectives achieved, German resistance overcome, casualties accepted in pursuit of victory. What they don't tell, what they carefully avoid mentioning, are the failures, the near disasters, the decisions that led to unnecessary casualties, the equipment that didn't work, the coordination that broke down. Howard makes notes in margins. Sanitize, next to reports of ammunition shortages. Omit, next to accounts of drowning casualties. Revise for clarity, next to descriptions of inter-unit coordination failures. The process of creating official history began before the battle ended. Army doctrine required combat units to submit after-action reports within 30 days of major operations. These reports were supposed to document what happened, what worked, what didn't, and what lessons should inform future operations. In practice, they became exercises in organizational self-presentation. Unit commanders understood that after-action reports would be read by superior officers and might affect their careers. They had incentives to emphasize successes, minimize failures, and frame disasters as learning experiences rather than evidence of incompetence. When I examine the original draft after-action reports from regimental and battalion level, archived separately from the final published versions, the editorial process becomes visible. Handwritten annotations show where supervisors requested revisions, entire paragraphs marked for deletion, statistics adjusted to be more favorable, language softened to reduce critical tone. The 502nd PIR's original report described the Sainte-Marie-du-Mont assault as costly advance, with casualty rates exceeding tactical value of ground gained. The published version describes it as determined assault against prepared defenses, resulting in capture of key terrain. Both statements are factually accurate. They tell dramatically different stories. The Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force established a historical section specifically to compile official narratives of major operations. This section reviewed unit-level reports and synthesized them into campaign histories that would become the authoritative record. A memo from the SHAEF Historical Section, dated July 3, 1944, provides explicit guidance on narrative tone. Recommends sanitization of all references to drowned casualties, ammunition shortages, inter-unit coordination failures, German effectiveness. Emphasize heroism, airborne innovation, inevitability of Allied success. The memo was signed by a colonel whose name I won't reproduce here, because the point isn't individual culpability, but institutional practice. The sanitization wasn't dishonest, exactly. The official histories didn't fabricate events or invent successes. They selectively emphasized information that supported the preferred narrative, while minimizing information that complicated it. Drowned casualties became casualties from all causes, without specifying that some men died from equipment failure rather than enemy action. Ammunition shortages became logistical challenges overcome through effective supply management. Coordination failures became fog of war complications successfully navigated by adaptive leadership. Every statement was defensible. The aggregate effect was to create a record that portrayed the Normandy airborne operation as more smoothly executed than it actually was. Howard's private correspondence, discovered in archives decades after his death, reveals his discomfort with the editorial process. A letter to a historian colleague, dated September 1944, includes this passage. They want heroism without cost, victory without friction. I'm becoming a novelist, not a historian. The men who fought deserve better than this sanitized version, but I'm ordered to produce what serves institutional purposes rather than historical accuracy. Howard continued in his role as division historical officer through the war. His official histories are competent and professionally written. They're also, by his own private assessment, incomplete and selectively curated. The gap between official history and lived experience appears most clearly in veteran interviews conducted years after the war. Soldiers who participated in actions described glowingly in official histories remember those same actions as confused, frightening, barely successful. The after-action report describes a coordinated assault on enemy positions, resulting in successful seizure of objectives. The veteran remembers getting lost in hedgerows, almost being killed by friendly fire, taking the objective through sheer luck, because the Germans withdrew before the attack actually succeeded. Both accounts describe the same event. They construct different meanings from it. The institutional incentive to curate history extends beyond individual reputation. The Army as an organization wanted to demonstrate that airborne operations were viable and effective. Massive resources had been invested in creating airborne divisions, training thousands of paratroopers, developing specialized equipment and tactics. If the Normandy operation had been portrayed as barely successful, despite catastrophic scatter and equipment failures, it would raise questions about whether airborne operations were worth the investment. The sanitized version, scattered drops confused Germans, creating tactical advantage from dispersion, justified the investment and supported continued airborne development. I find myself asking whether this matters. Does it matter that official histories are curated rather than comprehensive? From one perspective, no. The outcome is what matters. The invasion succeeded. Lives were saved overall because airborne operations secured the flanks. Whether the success was smooth or chaotic doesn't change the strategic result. From another perspective, yes. How we remember what happened shapes how we prepare for future operations. If official histories portray equipment that failed as having worked, future operations might rely on that equipment and experience similar failures. If coordination breakdowns are minimized, future operations won't emphasize the importance of interoperable communications. The most significant omission from official histories is probably the drowning casualties. These deaths appear in aggregate casualty statistics, but aren't discussed in operational narratives. The decision to minimize them was deliberate. A memo from Army Public Affairs, dated October 1944, argues that emphasis on non-combat deaths diminishes the heroic sacrifice narrative and may impact morale and recruitment. The argument has some merit. Families of drowned paratroopers might feel their sons' deaths were less meaningful if portrayed as equipment failures rather than combat sacrifices. But it also means that lessons about parachute harness design, drop zone selection, and equipment waterproofing weren't emphasized in official reports, because doing so would require acknowledging deaths that the institutional army preferred to minimize. To me, the curation of history represents an understandable but troubling institutional practice. Organizations naturally want to present themselves favorably. Commanders want to protect their reputations. The Army wants to justify resource allocation. These are normal, human, and institutional behaviors. But when official history becomes institutional narrative rather than comprehensive record, we lose access to the full complexity of what happened. The 101st Airborne's Normandy operation was simultaneously a success and a near disaster, achieved through adaptation to multiple failures that the plan didn't account for. That complexity makes the success more impressive, not less. It shows human capacity for improvisation under impossible conditions. But complexity doesn't fit neatly into heroic narratives, so it gets edited out, and what remains is a cleaner story that's less useful for understanding what actually happened. Chapter 17. The Veteran's Memory. History as Living Process. The year 2004. A hotel conference room in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The 60th anniversary reunion of the 101st Airborne Division's Normandy jump. Approximately 200 veterans in attendance, average age 80 years old. Many are here with families, children and grandchildren who want to hear the stories before the generation dies. A panel discussion is scheduled. 4 veterans who jumped on D-Day, interviewed by a military historian, discussing their experiences. The moderator asks about the drop itself. 4 different answers emerge. Same division, same night, 4 completely different memories of what happened and why it mattered. Dick Winters, whose Brecourt Manor assault became famous through Band of Brothers, describes the drop as difficult, but ultimately successful through adaptation and leadership. He emphasizes how scattered units formed ad hoc groups and accomplished missions despite chaos. His narrative arc moves from confusion to resolution, classic story structure where disorder is overcome through human agency. Bradford Freeman, sitting next to him, remembers the same operation differently. We were terrified and lucky. The job did itself through chaos. Freeman's version emphasizes contingency rather than control, luck rather than skill. Both men jumped with easy company. Both participated in the same operations. They've constructed different meanings from identical experiences. When I examine veteran testimony across multiple decades, interviews from 1945, 1964, 1984, 2004, what's striking is how memories evolve. The same veteran, interviewed at different points in life, tells different versions of the same events, not because they're lying or because memory is failing, but because the meaning we construct from experience changes as we age, as we gain perspective, as we're exposed to other accounts that shape how we remember our own. An interview from 1945, conducted 3 months after the events, emphasizes fear and confusion. An interview from 1990, 46 years later, emphasizes purpose and achievement. Both accurately represent how that veteran felt at those points in time. The neuroscience of memory explains some of this evolution. Memories aren't stored like video recordings that can be played back with perfect fidelity. They're reconstructed each time we recall them, and each reconstruction is influenced by our current state, our accumulated experiences, our exposure to other narratives. A veteran who's heard the official history of his unit's operations, who's read books and seen films depicting D-Day, who's discussed these events with other veterans over decades, that veteran's memory is a synthesis of personal experience and collective narrative. Distinguishing between what they personally experienced and what they've learned from other sources becomes impossible, even for the most honest and careful recollection. The panel discussion in 2004 illustrates this phenomenon. When asked about casualties on D-Day, 3 veterans give different estimates for their company's losses. One says, about 30%. Another says, maybe half. A third says, I don't know. We lost a lot of guys, but some showed up later, so it's hard to say. These aren't incompatible statements. Different people had access to different information, and casualties can mean different things. But they demonstrate that even for participants, the historical record is uncertain. If the men who were there can't agree on basic facts, how can historians writing 80 years later claim definitive knowledge? The most poignant moment in the 2004 reunion comes when a veteran describes an incident that isn't in any official record. He landed near a farmhouse and found 3 other paratroopers already there. They stayed together through D-Day, fighting as a makeshift team, accomplishing nothing of tactical significance, but surviving. He never learned their names. They separated on June 7th, when the unit was reorganizing. He's carried this memory for 60 years. 4 men in a Norman farmyard, unknown to each other, cooperating to survive. And it never appeared in any history, because there was no outcome worth documenting. His story represents thousands of similar experiences that happened and were never recorded. The impact of popular culture on veteran memory is significant and often unacknowledged. The 2004 reunion occurred after Band of Brothers aired in 2001. Many veterans describe feeling recognized by the series. Finally, the broader public understood what they'd experienced. But they also described feeling simplified. The series reduced complex experiences to dramatic narratives that emphasized action and heroism, while omitting boredom, administrative dysfunction, and moral ambiguity. Some veterans explicitly note that their memories have been influenced by the series. They remember events in terms of how Band of Brothers depicted them, even when they know their personal experience was different. Bradford Freeman's comment during a 2014 interview, shortly before his death, captures this tension. The story keeps getting bigger, but the truth keeps getting smaller. More people know about the 101st Airborne now than ever, but what they know is the Hollywood version. What we actually did, the mud and the fear and the friends who just disappeared, that gets lost. Freeman was the last surviving member of Easy Company. When he died in 2015, the transition from living memory to pure historical record was complete. No one alive had jumped with Easy Company on D-Day. The only access to those experiences is through documented accounts, each filtered through the limitations and biases of documentation. The responsibility we have to complexity and memory is significant. The easy approach is to treat veteran testimony as either reliable eyewitness accounts or unreliable memory influenced by time and culture. The sophisticated approach recognizes that testimony is both. It contains genuine information about experiences and is also shaped by how those experiences are processed over decades. We can extract value from testimony while acknowledging its limitations. The veteran who says, "We lost about 30%, isn't giving us a precise statistic to write in history books. He's giving us his impression, filtered through trauma and time, of what it felt like to lose that many people from his unit. As artificial intelligence and historical simulation become more sophisticated in 2026, we face new questions about how to preserve the complexity of events like the Normandy drop. AI can generate coherent narratives from historical data. It can create seamless documentaries that present clean, confident accounts of what happened. But what gets lost is the friction, the contradictions, the unknowability that define real history. The scatter pattern wasn't just a military problem, it's a historical problem. We literally cannot know with certainty where many paratroopers landed, how they died, what they accomplished. We have fragments, and from fragments we construct narratives. The question is whether we acknowledge the construction process or present the narrative as if it's simply truth discovered. To me, the veteran reunions represent the final phase of historical memory before transition to pure documentation. These men carry experiences that cannot be fully conveyed through documents. When they die, and by 2026, virtually all World War II veterans have died, we lose access to a dimension of historical knowledge that can't be reconstructed from archives. What remains are documents, photographs, recorded interviews, and the stories we tell about the documents. The 101st Airborne's Normandy operation becomes what we've written about it, what we've filmed about it, what we've taught about it. The messy reality, the equipment failures, the drowned men, the ammunition shortages, the confused firefights, persists in archives for researchers who go looking. But the public memory is the curated narrative, the heroic story, the version that fits our need to believe that sacrifice had meaning and chaos had purpose. The last panel discussion question at the 2004 reunion asked, "What should we remember about D-Day?" The answers varied. Winters, the importance of leadership and training. Freeman, how much was luck and how many of our friends didn't come home? Another veteran, that it was both more important and less glorious than people think. The historian moderating thanked them and noted that all their answers were correct, which was diplomatic but also true. History isn't a single story. It's multiple perspectives on complex events, viewed through lenses that change based on who's looking, and when they're looking, and what they need to see. The 101st Airborne jumped into Normandy on June 6, 1944. That's a fact. Everything else, the meaning, the lessons, the legacy, is interpretation, valuable but ultimately provisional, subject to revision as new evidence emerges, and as our needs for historical meaning evolve.